Women are panicking. The most shocking reality hitting society right now is that millions of men have completely walked away from dating, relationships, and even real world intimacy with women, choosing instead endless hours of intense personal gratification through adult content that leaves them in a trance like state far more satisfying than anything actual encounters provide. Women from every ideological side, including those who once demanded men leave them alone and those who claim to value traditional roles, are now uniting in outright panic because this shift threatens their long held leverage over men's attention, resources, and desires. Stay until the end because what comes next reveals exactly why this escape has become so powerful for men and why the pushback from both feminists and traditionalists is growing desperate in ways no one saw coming. And just remember, if you want tomorrow's video today, hit the join button to get early access to all of my latest uploads. Men have reached a breaking point after decades of societal messages that painted masculinity as toxic, approaches as creepy, and traditional provider roles as outdated burdens rather than respected contributions. They listened when told to stay away, to stop pursuing, to respect boundaries without question. And now they have built lives centered on their own peace, independence, and fulfillment without the constant drama, expectations, or emotional labor that often came with relationships. This withdrawal did not happen overnight. It built slowly through repeated experiences where efforts to connect were met with dismissal, where respect was demanded but rarely reciprocated, and where the risks of rejection, false accusations, or legal entanglements outweighed any potential rewards. Men began focusing on careers, hobbies, fitness, friendships, and personal growth, finding that solitude brought clarity and calm that chaotic interactions never could. The economy has only accelerated this trend, with high inflation driving up rent, food prices, utilities, and everyday costs to levels that make supporting a household feel impossible for many, especially when combined with stagnant wages and job insecurity that leave people paycheck to paycheck despite full time work. In this environment, men see little incentive to take on additional financial and emotional responsibilities for someone who may not value their efforts, leading them to prioritize their own stability and mental well being above all else. What has truly alarmed so many women is the rise of gooning, a practice where men engage in prolonged sessions of self stimulation while consuming carefully curated adult material, often edging for hours or even days to reach a deeply immersive, trance like state of arousal rather than rushing to completion. This is not casual viewing. It involves dedicated setups with multiple screens, synchronized audio, specific playlists, and communities sharing techniques to extend the experience into something profoundly absorbing. Participants describe it as an ego dissolving escape, a temporary surrender to overstimulation that provides euphoria without the complications of real partners, such as performance pressure, emotional vulnerability, health risks, or rejection. For many, it has become preferable because it delivers consistent, customizable satisfaction on demand, free from negotiation, compromise, or disappointment. Surveys and reports from those who have studied these groups show that a significant number of participants are young men in their 20s and 30s who have largely sworn off real relationships, identifying as pornosexual, or simply finding the digital alternative more reliable and less draining. They build elaborate environments, sometimes called goon caves, rigged for maximum immersion, and connect anonymously in online spaces to share and enhance the experience, turning isolation into a collective pursuit of this altered state. The panic from women stems directly from the realization that men are discovering sexual and even emotional gratification that excludes them entirely, removing the traditional leverage that sex and attention have long held in gender dynamics. Throughout history, access to intimacy has been a powerful currency. often the fallback when other avenues of influence falter. But now men are opting out en masse. Platforms like OnlyFans allow creators to monetize directly. Visual novels and animated content provide narrative depth and fantasy fulfillment without human interaction. And free or low cost material floods the internet with endless variety. Men report preferring these options because they avoid the pitfalls of modern dating, such as constant testing, entitlement, or the need to perform endlessly to maintain interest in an era where attention spans have been shortened by endless scrolling and short form content. Women who once celebrated independence and told men they were not needed now face the consequences as attention dries up, leaving many scrambling in an economy where high costs make single life increasingly precarious without shared resources or support. This convergence of interests has created an unlikely alliance between feminist groups pushing to restrict adult content and traditional or anti feminist voices calling for bans on platforms like OnlyFans. Feminists have long critiqued pornography as exploitative, objectifying, and harmful to societal views of women, leading to campaigns that pressure platforms to remove certain material, including petitions that resulted in widespread delistings of adult oriented games from major digital stores in recent years. These efforts often focus on protecting vulnerable users or curbing what they see as normalized violence or degradation, but the underlying motivation appears tied to discomfort with men finding satisfaction independently. Meanwhile, those advocating traditional values decry the same platforms as promoting degeneracy, luring men away from family responsibilities and moral living, and argue for heavy taxation or outright prohibition to discourage participation. Proposals have emerged for significant sin taxes on earnings from sites like OnlyFans, framed as ways to deter the behavior while redirecting funds toward education, mental health support for men, or family oriented programs. One such idea suggested a steep percentage tax specifically targeting creators in certain states, with the revenue aimed at improving schools and addressing related social issues, though creators have pushed back strongly, arguing it unfairly targets legitimate work and personal choices. The irony runs deep because both sides, despite their differences in rhetoric, seek to reassert control over men's desires and direct them back toward traditional or approved channels. Feminists frame restrictions as empowerment and protection against harm, while traditionalists present them as safeguards for family structures and moral order. Yet the end result aligns in limiting men's access to these autonomous outlets. Men, having internalized years of messages to step back and focus inward, now resist these efforts fiercely, viewing them as attempts to police their thoughts, bodies, and private freedoms after being told for so long that their advances were unwelcome. This pushback has only intensified the divide as men double down on solitude and digital escapes, finding communities that validate their choices without judgment or demands. Economic pressures amplify everything here. With rising costs squeezing everyone, women face particular hardships when men withdraw financial or emotional support they once provided willingly. Rent, groceries, utilities, and debt accumulate rapidly, and the promise of independence rings hollow when basic survival becomes a daily struggle. Men, meanwhile, channel their resources into personal security, hobbies, or even travel abroad, where cultural dynamics feel more balanced and appreciative. The passport bro phenomenon showed this early, with men seeking partners overseas who they perceived as more feminine, fit, and approachable, rejecting what they saw as entitlement or hostility at home. Women responded with accusations of exploitation, but the trend continued because it addressed real frustrations. Now, with gooning and similar practices offering even lower effort fulfillment, the exodus from real world intimacy has accelerated, leaving a vacuum that sparks desperation. Men are not rushing back. They have tasted freedom from constant validation seeking, from walking on eggshells, from relationships that drain more than they give. They prioritize peace, focusing on self improvement, financial stability, and genuine connections that do not come with hidden costs. The data on declining marriage rates, falling birth rates, and increasing singlehood among men under 40 tells a clear story of deliberate choice rather than failure. Women who once weaponized rejection now confront the reality that men have adapted, building lives that no longer revolve around them. This shift challenges long standing power structures where attention from men served as social currency, validation, and economic security. When that currency vanishes, panic follows, manifesting in calls to ban, tax, or shame the alternatives men have embraced. The deeper truth is that men have simply listened and acted on the instructions given over decades. They stopped approaching in public after being told it was harassment. They stopped pursuing after being labeled toxic for initiative. They stopped committing after seeing high divorce filings, asset divisions, and cultural narratives that devalued their roles. Now, with digital alternatives providing what real interactions no longer do reliably, they have no incentive to return. The intensity of gooning sessions reflects not just addiction, but a profound adaptation to rejection, a way to reclaim control over pleasure in a world that made it feel risky or futile elsewhere. Communities form around this, sharing knowledge and support, turning what could be lonely into something communal yet still private. The trance state offers escape from societal pressures, from performance anxiety, from the fear of missteps that could end careers or reputations. Women sense the loss acutely because it removes their primary remaining leverage in a society where economic independence remains uneven and inflation erodes gains. The push for restrictions grows louder as desperation mounts, but it only reinforces men's resolve to stay away. They see these efforts as confirmation that autonomy is under threat, that even private choices face external control. The result is a standoff where men continue building solitary but peaceful lives, while the calls to ban or tax grow more frantic, revealing just how much the old dynamics depended on men's participation. This is not about hatred or blame. It is about consequences. Actions have reactions. Messages sent for years have been received, and men have responded by walking away entirely. The panic now unfolding shows the fragility of systems built on one sided expectations. Men have found alternatives that work for them, and they are not inclined to abandon what brings peace for what once brought pain. The story continues to unfold as economic realities bite harder, as digital escapes evolve, and as society grapples with what happens when half the population opts out of the game entirely. The shift away from traditional intimacy has created ripple effects that extend far beyond bedroom doors and dating apps, reaching into every corner of how people build lives, spend money, and view the future. Men who once saw marriage or long term partnerships as natural milestones now treat them as optional at best, often as high risk ventures with poor returns. Statistics show marriage rates among men under 35 continuing to plummet year after year, with many openly stating they see no practical benefit in committing resources, time, or emotional energy when digital alternatives deliver satisfaction without strings attached. This is not mere laziness or fear of commitment. It represents a calculated response to incentives that have steadily deteriorated. When the cost of dating includes endless vetting processes, financial expectations that outpace earnings growth, and the ever present possibility of sudden withdrawal of affection or worse, legal and financial fallout, the math stops adding up for a growing number of men. They redirect those resources inward, investing in skill development, side businesses, travel, physical health, or simply building financial buffers that protect their independence in an unpredictable economy. Gooning itself has evolved from a niche practice into a structured lifestyle for some, complete with routines, tools, and philosophies that emphasize prolonged arousal as a form of self mastery rather than mere indulgence. Practitioners talk about training their bodies and minds to delay gratification for extended periods, sometimes measuring sessions in hours rather than minutes, using breathing techniques, specific postures, hydration strategies, and even supplements to maintain focus and stamina. The goal is often described as reaching a flow state similar to deep meditation or intense athletic performance where the mind quiets and external concerns fade away. This trance offers a level of control and predictability that real world encounters rarely match. There is no risk of misreading signals, no negotiation over preferences, no aftermath of emotional processing or potential regret. The experience is entirely self directed, customizable down to the smallest detail, and repeatable without diminishing returns as long as variety and discipline are maintained. Communities dedicated to this practice share detailed guides on optimizing setups from lighting and sound design to content curation that keeps the mind engaged without tipping over into overstimulation that ends the session prematurely. What alarms critics the most is how effectively this model replicates aspects of intimacy that women traditionally provided, but without any need for reciprocity or vulnerability. Men describe forming genuine attachments to fictional characters in visual novels or animated series, experiencing emotional highs through storylines that feel more consistent and rewarding than many real relationships. These narratives often include deep character development, loyalty, affection, and fantasy fulfillment tailored precisely to individual tastes, something increasingly difficult to find in modern dating, where superficial judgments and quick swipes dominate. The emotional component should not be underestimated. While physical release remains central, the prolonged buildup creates a sense of connection, anticipation, and even companionship that fills voids left by social isolation or repeated rejection. For men who have faced consistent dismissal in real life, this digital companionship feels safer and more reliable, leading many to conclude that investing further in real world pursuit is simply not worth the effort or risk. The economic dimension cannot be separated from the sexual one. Inflation has pushed basic living expenses to levels that force difficult choices for everyone, but the impact hits differently when men opt out of provider roles. Women who once relied on male attention translating into financial help, whether through dating, marriage, or even casual support networks, now face a shrinking pool of willing participants. Rent increases of 20 to 40% in major cities over the past few years, combined with grocery prices that have risen steadily, make single life precarious for many. When men choose to keep their earnings for themselves, prioritizing personal savings, investments, or leisure over shared expenses, the pressure mounts. This is not spite, it is self preservation. Men have watched friends go through divorces that left them financially devastated, seen cultural narratives shift to portray traditional masculinity as oppressive rather than protective, and experienced firsthand how quickly appreciation can turn to criticism when expectations are not met perfectly. The decision to walk away becomes rational when the perceived benefits no longer outweigh the costs. Legislative responses reveal the depth of concern. Discussions around syntaxes on adult content platforms have gained traction in several regions, with proposals ranging from modest levies to steep percentages aimed specifically at high earning creators. Supporters argue these measures would generate revenue for public services while discouraging what they view as harmful behavior that contributes to declining family formation and social cohesion. Critics counter that such taxes disproportionately target legal, consensual adult work and infringe on personal freedoms, especially when similar scrutiny is rarely applied to other forms of entertainment or vice industries. The focus on OnlyFans, in particular, highlights the contradiction. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Platforms that feminists once hailed as empowering for women through direct monetization now face calls for restriction from some of the same voices, revealing that the real issue may be less about exploitation and more about who controls access to male desire and resources. Traditionalists join the chorus, framing the content as corrosive to moral values and family stability, pushing for outright bans or heavy regulation under the guise of protecting young men from addiction and women from objectification. Yet, the harder these restrictions are pursued, the more men dig in. They view every new petition, every proposed law, every public shaming campaign as validation of their choice to disengage. The message received over decades was clear: stay away, do not approach, respect space at all costs. Men complied. And now, when they exercise that same space in private, the backlash arrives swiftly. This creates a feedback loop where attempts to force re engagement only strengthen resolve to remain independent. Digital spaces provide anonymity, support, and innovation that keep evolving faster than regulators can respond. New platforms emerge, decentralized alternatives appear, and communities grow more sophisticated in protecting their activities from external interference. The result is a quiet but determined resistance that refuses to return to dynamics many now see as fundamentally unfair. Stories from men who have fully embraced this path illustrate the transformation. Some describe years of frustration in dating, constant second guessing, and emotional exhaustion that left them questioning their worth. After discovering gooning communities, they found a space where their desires were not judged, where effort translated directly into reward, and where peace replaced anxiety. They report improved focus in other areas of life because the outlet removes the nagging distraction of unmet needs. Fitness improves, careers advance, friendships deepen without romantic competition, and finances stabilize as money stays in their control. The trade off is solitude, but for many it feels like liberation rather than loss. They no longer chase validation from others. They generate it internally through discipline, creativity, and self reliance. Women on the other side express growing frustration as the landscape changes. Social media posts lament the lack of quality partners, the rise of men who seem uninterested in commitment, and the difficulty of finding men willing to approach or provide in traditional ways. Some blame cultural shifts, others point to economic hardship, but few acknowledge the direct connection to messages sent over years that discouraged pursuit and emphasized independence. The panic manifests in different forms depending on perspective. Progressive voices call for content moderation and platform accountability, framing the issue as public health or gender equity. Conservative voices demand moral renewal through policy, emphasizing family values and traditional roles. Both converge on restricting the outlets men have adopted, revealing a shared discomfort with male autonomy in the sexual realm. This discomfort arises because the old bargain has broken down. For generations, access to intimacy served as leverage in negotiations over resources, status, and security. When that access becomes optional and replaceable, the power dynamic shifts dramatically. Men no longer need to negotiate for what they can obtain alone, leading to a reevaluation of what relationships offer beyond physical satisfaction. Companionship, emotional support, shared goals, and mutual growth remain valuable, but only when they come without entitlement, manipulation, or unequal expectations. Many men conclude that these qualities are rarer in practice than promised, especially when digital alternatives provide fantasy versions that feel more consistent and less risky. The broader societal implications continue to unfold. Birth rates in developed nations have fallen below replacement levels in many places, contributing to long term demographic challenges that governments struggle to address. Economic models built on dual income households face strain when fewer people form those households. Mental health trends show rising loneliness across genders, yet the solutions proposed often ignore the root causes of male withdrawal. Instead of examining why men have disengaged so thoroughly, the focus remains on restricting their coping mechanisms rather than addressing the conditions that drove them to seek alternatives in the first place. Men continue building lives that prioritize inner peace and external achievement without romantic entanglement. They travel more freely, pursue passions without compromise, and form bonds based on shared interests rather than obligation. The absence of constant relational stress allows clearer thinking, better decision making, and greater resilience in facing economic uncertainty. For those who once felt trapped by societal expectations to pursue, provide, and perform, this freedom represents a hard won victory. They have no intention of surrendering it for promises that have proven unreliable in the past. The push to ban or heavily tax these outlets will likely intensify as the trend becomes impossible to ignore. Petitions will circulate, lawmakers will propose bills, and media narratives will amplify concern. Yet history shows that prohibition rarely eliminates demand, it merely drives it underground or into more resilient forms. Men have already adapted once by walking away from real world pursuit. They will adapt again if necessary, finding new ways to preserve their autonomy and satisfaction. The lesson remains clear: forced compliance, and people find ways to escape. Offer mutual respect and fair incentives, and participation returns naturally. Until that balance is restored, the divide will widen and the panic will grow. The momentum behind this withdrawal has created entire subcultures that thrive precisely because they exist outside the traditional expectations of courtship, provision, and performance. Online forums dedicated to these lifestyles have grown into sprawling networks where men exchange strategies not just for extending sessions, but for integrating the practice into broader routines that enhance overall life quality. Discussions cover everything from ergonomic chair setups that prevent back strain during long periods to dietary adjustments that support sustained energy without crashes to mental exercises that sharpen focus and deepen the immersive quality of the experience. Participants emphasize discipline as the cornerstone, viewing the ability to maintain control over arousal for hours as a form of personal power that spills over into other domains. They report sharper decision making at work, greater patience in high stress situations, and a noticeable reduction in the compulsive need for external approval that once drove endless swiping or anxious messaging. This internal shift represents a reclamation of agency in an era where many feel external forces constantly dictate behavior and worth. Critics often reduce the phenomenon to addiction or escapism, but that framing misses the deliberate nature of the choice. Men who adopt this path frequently describe a moment of clarity after years of trying to navigate a dating market that felt rigged against them. They recount patterns of inconsistent interest where initial enthusiasm faded quickly into disinterest or demands that escalated without corresponding investment from the other side. They speak of being expected to lead, plan, pay, entertain, and emotionally regulate while receiving minimal reciprocity in return. The cumulative effect eroded confidence and created a sense of futility. When digital alternatives arrived that delivered physical pleasure, narrative engagement, and emotional simulation, without those asymmetries, the decision to pivot became straightforward. The practice is not about fleeing reality entirely, but about selecting a reality that respects boundaries, rewards effort proportionally, and imposes no hidden penalties for imperfection. This selectivity extends to content preferences as well. Many gravitate toward material that emphasizes enthusiasm, loyalty, and idealized dynamics rather than cynicism or detachment. Visual novels, in particular, have surged in popularity because they combine interactive storytelling with adult elements, allowing players to shape relationships that unfold over dozens of hours with branching paths, character growth, and resolutions that feel earned. These games often feature protagonists who overcome challenges through persistence and kindness, receiving unwavering support and affection in return, a stark contrast to experiences where effort met indifference or contempt. The emotional payoff comes not just from physical aspects, but from witnessing consistent appreciation, something many men report missing in real interactions. Animated content follows similar patterns, offering flawless execution of fantasies without the unpredictability of human mood swings or shifting priorities. The reliability becomes addictive in its own right, fostering loyalty to creators and franchises that deliver what they promise every time. The backlash against these preferences has taken on increasingly creative forms. Beyond calls for bans and taxes, some voices advocate for educational campaigns aimed at young men, warning of supposed long term damage to relationship skills, empathy, or even brain chemistry. These arguments draw on selective studies about excessive consumption while ignoring parallel research showing that moderate, intentional use correlates with lower stress and higher life satisfaction in certain demographics. Other proposals include age gating measures far stricter than current standards, mandatory counseling referrals for frequent users, or integration of warning labels on platforms similar to those on tobacco products. Each suggestion meets resistance because men see them as infantilizing, treating competent adults as incapable of managing private choices. The perception grows that these interventions aim less at protection and more at restoration of a status quo, where male desire flows through approved channels that benefit specific groups. Economic self interest plays a central role in sustaining the trend. With housing costs consuming larger shares of income, many men calculate that maintaining a single lifestyle costs significantly less than supporting a partner or family unit. They invest the difference in index funds, skill certifications, real estate down payments for future solo ownership, or experiences like international travel that broaden perspectives without relational overhead. The freedom to allocate capital this way creates compounding advantages over time. Compound interest works quietly but powerfully when unburdened by shared expenses or unexpected obligations. Men who once diverted substantial portions of earnings toward dates, gifts, vacations for two, or household contributions now watch those same dollars grow in accounts under their sole control. The psychological security that comes from financial independence reinforces the decision to remain untethered, creating a virtuous cycle of stability and autonomy. Women navigating the same economic landscape face different pressures when traditional avenues of support diminish. Many express bewilderment at the speed with which men have disengaged, assuming that basic biology or cultural norms would eventually pull them back. Yet, the longer the separation persists, the more evident it becomes that incentives have permanently realigned. Social circles shrink for some as coupled friends drift away. Dating pools appear thinner, and casual encounters carry higher emotional risk without corresponding reward. The rhetoric shifts from dismissal to concern, with public conversations increasingly focused on the loneliness epidemic, declining fertility, and the need to rekindle connection. Solutions proposed range from relationship coaching to policy incentives for marriage and childbearing, but few address the foundational grievances that drove men away initially. Until those root issues receive honest examination, surface level fixes tend to fall flat. Men, meanwhile, continue refining their approach. Some experiment with periodic abstinence from the practice to test whether real world pursuit holds renewed appeal, only to reaffirm that the cost benefit ratio remains unfavorable. Others integrate social elements selectively, maintaining friendships, mentorships, or professional networks while keeping romantic involvement off the table. The absence of romantic pressure allows deeper platonic bonds to form, unclouded by unspoken expectations or competition. Hobbies flourish in this environment. Men report picking up instruments, learning languages, mastering trades, or building complex projects because mental bandwidth, once consumed by relational anxiety, now channels into creation and mastery. The satisfaction derived from tangible progress often surpasses the fleeting validation once sought through romantic success. Legislative efforts continue evolving in response. Recent hearings in various jurisdictions have featured testimony from mental health professionals, economists, and policy analysts debating the societal cost of widespread disengagement. Some argue that reduced family formation accelerates aging populations and strains entitlement systems, justifying intervention. Others counter that forcing participation through restriction or taxation violates core liberties and ignores personal agency in intimate matters. The debate grows heated because it touches on fundamental questions about consent, freedom, and the proper role of government in private sexual behavior. Proposals for platform level changes gain traction in parallel with calls for algorithms to deprioritize certain content or for mandatory breaks after extended viewing periods. Tech companies face pressure to comply voluntarily, wary of regulatory backlash. Yet innovation in decentralized spaces continues to outpace centralized control. The cultural narrative around masculinity has begun to fracture further. Traditional voices lament the loss of provider instincts and family oriented ambition, framing withdrawal as selfish or immature. Progressive perspectives sometimes portray the same behavior as entitlement or avoidance of accountability, suggesting men must relearn emotional labor and vulnerability. Both critiques converge on urging return to conventional roles, yet neither fully grapples with why those roles lost appeal so rapidly. Men respond by pointing to lived experience rather than abstract ideals, emphasizing that respect, appreciation, and fairness must precede demands for commitment. When those elements were absent or inconsistent, opting out became the logical defense mechanism. This defense mechanism has proven remarkably durable. Communities share success stories of men who, after years of following the path, achieve milestones once thought incompatible with singledom. Home ownership in desirable areas, early retirement planning, extensive world travel, physical transformations, creative output, and profound self knowledge. These accomplishments stand as living proof that fulfillment does not require partnership. The visibility of such outcomes encourages others to experiment with similar trajectories, normalizing what was once considered fringe. Peer validation replaces societal approval, creating resilience against external criticism. As economic headwinds intensify, the divide sharpens, inflation continues eroding purchasing power, wages lag behind living costs in many sectors, and housing shortages persist in urban centers. Men who maintain lean lifestyles weather these storms more effectively, preserving options while others struggle under heavier burdens. The contrast fuels resentment in some quarters, with accusations that men hoard resources rather than contribute to collective stability. Yet, from the men's perspective, the hoarding represents earned protection after decades of being positioned as default providers without corresponding security or gratitude. The stalemate persists because neither side fully trusts the other's intentions. Looking forward, the trajectory suggests further polarization before any meaningful reconciliation. Digital ecosystems will keep innovating, offering ever more sophisticated simulations of connection, pleasure, and narrative satisfaction. Regulation will attempt to curb access, sparking cat and mouse games between creators and enforcers. Social attitudes will continue shifting, with younger generations observing the experiment and drawing their own conclusions about risk and reward in relationships. The panic that initially drove calls for bans has evolved into a broader anxiety about demographic futures, economic models, and cultural cohesion. Yet men show no widespread inclination to reverse course without fundamental changes in how masculinity, desire, and contribution are regarded. The story remains unfinished. Each passing year adds data points. Further declines in marriage and birth statistics, rising savings rates among single men in their 30s, increased participation in niche online spaces, and louder debates in public forums. What emerges clearly is that this is no temporary fad. It represents a structural realignment driven by experience, economics, technology, and self interest. Men have adapted to a world that repeatedly signaled their expendability in romantic contexts. They built alternatives that serve them well. Reversing that adaptation would require more than restriction or taxation. It would demand genuine reevaluation of incentives, respect, and reciprocity on a societal scale. Until then, the walk away continues, steady and deliberate, reshaping everything in its wake. The resistance to returning has hardened into something structural, almost architectural, in the way men organize their days, weeks, and years. Mornings once spent scrolling dating apps or mentally rehearsing approaches now begin with deliberate routines built around personal sovereignty. Coffee brewed exactly to preference, workouts timed for peak energy rather than social visibility, commutes optimized for podcasts or audiobooks that build knowledge instead of chasing conversational currency for potential dates. Evenings stretch long because there is no one waiting at home with unspoken expectations or timelines. The quiet that used to feel like failure now registers as space for thought, reading dense material, tinkering with side projects, or simply sitting in stillness without needing to fill it with performance. This architecture of solitude did not emerge by accident. It was engineered piece by piece after each disappointing interaction reinforced the same lesson. External pursuit carried disproportionate downside compared to internal cultivation. Communities that support this architecture have matured beyond simple encouragement into ecosystems with their own economies, norms, and hierarchies. Some spaces function like private academies where experienced members mentor newcomers on everything from hardware configurations that maximize screen real estate without eye strain to psychological frameworks for reframing desire as a renewable resource rather than a depleting one. Others operate more like think tanks, analyzing cultural shifts, economic data, and policy proposals with a level of rigor that rivals academic departments. Threads dissect proposed legislation line by line, forecasting enforcement challenges, loopholes, and unintended consequences. Members compile dossiers on lawmakers who champion restrictive measures, tracking voting records, campaign donors, and public statements to map the incentives driving the pushback. This level of collective intelligence turns what could be scattered frustration into coordinated awareness, making it harder for top down interventions to catch participants off guard. One recurring theme in these discussions is the concept of optionality. Men emphasize preserving as many viable paths as possible rather than locking into any single trajectory that depends on another person's goodwill. Digital gratification preserves optionality in the sexual domain, while career advancement, asset accumulation, geographic mobility, and skill stacking preserve it in every other domain. The philosophy boils down to refusing single points of failure. When intimacy required trusting another human being not to weaponize vulnerability, reject effort midstream, or exit with half the resources, it became the ultimate single point of failure for many. Replacing that variable with a deterministic system, content that responds exactly as programmed, communities that judge only on shared values, hardware that performs reliably, eliminates the weakest link. Optionality compounds over time. Each year of preserved freedom adds another layer of insulation against coercion, whether economic, social, or legal. Women observing this shift from the outside frequently describe a sense of betrayal, as though an implicit contract was unilaterally canceled. The contract, in their telling, involved men continuing to seek, provide, and commit despite changing cultural conditions because biology or tradition supposedly demanded it. Yet that contract was never explicitly signed. It was assumed, enforced through social pressure, and gradually eroded by the same forces that told men their traditional roles were toxic or optional. When men took the messages at face value, step back, do not impose, focus on yourself, they did exactly that, and the resulting vacuum created cognitive dissonance. The dissonance manifests in contradictory rhetoric, simultaneous celebration of independence and lamentation over its consequences, praise for female empowerment alongside frustration at male disengagement, calls for equality paired with demands that men resume unequal burdens. The contradiction reveals itself most clearly when restrictions are proposed. The same platforms once defended as empowering suddenly become public menaces when men use parallel versions of them for their own ends. Policy responses have begun fragmenting along predictable lines. In some jurisdictions, moderate voices push for harm reduction approaches, better age verification, voluntary spending limits, mental health resources linked to heavy usage patterns, educational modules in schools about healthy consumption. These proposals aim to mitigate downsides without outright prohibition, recognizing that demand will not vanish simply because supply is throttled. Harder line factions reject compromise, insisting that only decisive action, outright delisting of categories, steep platform taxes, criminal penalties for certain creators can reverse the trend. The hardliners often frame the issue in existential terms. Civilization itself hangs in the balance if men continue opting out of reproduction and family formation at current rates. They point to empty school classrooms in 20 years, shrinking workforces, overburdened pension systems, and cultural atrophy as downstream effects. The rhetoric escalates because the numbers support the concern. Fertility rates in advanced economies have dropped below 1.6 in many places, well under the 2.1 replacement threshold, and male participation in family building tracks even lower in certain demographics. Men counter these apocalyptic narratives with data of their own. They highlight that voluntary childlessness among both sexes has risen steadily for decades, driven by housing unaffordability, career demands, climate anxiety, and shifting values around legacy. They note that countries with strong social safety nets and gender egalitarian policies still face declining births, suggesting the driver is not male withdrawal alone, but broader structural realities. Most importantly, they argue that attempting to engineer higher fertility through sexual restriction amounts to treating a symptom while ignoring the disease. If policymakers truly wanted more families, the reasoning goes, they would address root causes, make housing affordable again, stabilize real wages, shorten work weeks, subsidize childcare without punitive tax structures, and foster cultural environments where commitment feels like mutual gain rather than unilateral sacrifice. Until those levers are pulled, restricting private outlets looks less like concern for the future and more like panicked resource hoarding. The resource hoarding perception fuels a growing separatist sentiment in some corners. Certain men openly discuss geographic relocation, not just for cultural fit, but for jurisdictional advantage, moving to places with minimal content regulation, favorable tax environments for digital nomads, lower cost of living that stretches savings further, and social climates less saturated with guilt inducing narratives around masculinity. Destinations range from Southeast Asian hubs with strong expat communities to Eastern European cities offering affordability and traditional aesthetics without the ideological baggage of Western capitals. These moves are rarely impulsive. They follow months and years of research, visa strategy sessions, cost of living calculators, and trial visits. The pattern mirrors earlier passport BRO waves, but with a crucial difference. Many no longer seek partners abroad. They seek environments where solitude remains viable and external interference stays low. The goal is not replacement, but reinforcement of the autonomous life already constructed. Back home, the contrast sharpens daily. Cities once buzzing with young professionals pairing off now show visible surpluses in certain age brackets. Bars and restaurants that thrived on date night revenue report softer midweek traffic. Matchmaking services quietly pivot toward female clients because male signups have dried up. Real estate agents note single men buying smaller units outright rather than waiting for dual income qualification. Gyms catering to serious lifters see membership growth among men in their late 20s and 30s who channel energy once spent on courtship into physique and strength. The physical transformation often accompanies the psychological one. Broader shoulders, lower body fat, clearer skin from consistent sleep and nutrition, all markers of resources redirected inward rather than outward. Critics sometimes interpret these changes as narcissism or arrested development, yet participants describe the opposite: maturity through self accountability. When no one else depends on your performance, discipline becomes intrinsic rather than performative. Goals shift from impressing others to surpassing personal benchmarks. The absence of relational drama creates bandwidth for long term thinking, compound investment strategies, skill trees that span years, health protocols designed for decades rather than seasons. Men in their 30s report feeling more like adults than they did in their 20s because they carry full responsibility for their outcomes without outsourcing emotional labor or financial cushioning to partners who may leave. This maturity clashes with external perceptions that still frame single men as incomplete or defective. Media portrayals lean toward pity or mockery. The lonely gamer, the basement dwelling recluse, the bitter incel archetype. Yet the reality on the ground looks different. These men maintain careers, pay taxes, volunteer in communities, mentor younger relatives, travel responsibly, and contribute creatively without needing romantic validation as a prerequisite. The disconnect breeds resentment. When caricatures fail to match lived experience, trust in institutions that propagate them erodes further, reinforcing the decision to disengage. The erosion of trust extends to dating platforms themselves. Once heralded as democratizing romance, they now face accusations of algorithmic manipulation that rewards superficial traits, inflates female selectivity, and keeps male users in perpetual spending loops. Many men who once paid for premium features now view those subscriptions as a tax on hope. The realization that platforms profit most when users remain single and searching prompted mass exodus toward free or decentralized alternatives, further starving the ecosystem of male attention. Women who stayed report thinner matches, longer dry spells, and a pervasive sense that the men still active are lower investment types. The spiral accelerates. Fewer quality men participate, lowering the perceived value of the space, driving more away. Throughout all of this, the core practice, prolonged, intentional self gratification, remains a constant. It serves as both anchor and barometer. When life feels chaotic, the session provides reset. When external pressure mounts, it reaffirms control. When doubt creeps in about the path, the intensity of the experience reminds participants why they chose it over alternatives that consistently under-delivered. The practice evolves with the man. Early adopters who began in their early 20s now approach their 30s with refined techniques, deeper understanding of their physiology, and a calm certainty that the trade offs were worthwhile. They look back at younger selves, chasing validation through pursuit, and see the inefficiency clearly. Time, money, emotion, and dignity spent on uncertain returns now seem like poor capital allocation. Society at large has only begun reckoning with the scale of this reallocation. Economists model scenarios where persistent male disengagement reduces consumer spending on certain categories: jewelry, fine dining, luxury travel for couples, while boosting others out gaming hardware, home theater equipment, personal fitness tech, solo adventure gear. Demographers warn of inverted population pyramids and shrinking tax bases. Sociologists study loneliness metrics that show both gender suffering, yet male withdrawal appears more deliberate and less lamented internally. Politicians float pronatalist policies, baby bonuses, housing credits, extended paternity leave, yet hesitate to confront the attitudinal shift at the root. The hesitation stems partly from fear of backlash. Any policy perceived as pressuring men to re engage romantically risks being labeled coercive in an era hypersensitive to consent. Men watch these developments with detached curiosity. Most have already internalized that their participation is no longer assumed. They have built lives robust enough to withstand cultural headwinds, economic turbulence, and legislative experiments. The longer the standoff lasts, the more natural the separation feels. What began as reaction has solidified into preference, preference into identity, identity into architecture. And architecture, once built, resists demolition. The question that lingers unspoken in every debate is whether the clock can be turned back without force. Force has been tried in various forms: shaming, restriction, taxation, moral suasion, and each attempt has so far strengthened resolve rather than softened it. The alternative path, rarely discussed seriously, would require dismantling decades of accumulated resentment through consistent, tangible demonstrations of mutual value. Respect shown in action rather than demanded in theory. Appreciation offered freely rather than conditionally. Fairness applied symmetrically rather than selectively. Until that standard becomes the norm rather than the exception, men will continue investing in systems that deliver certainty instead of gambling on ones that have repeatedly broken faith. The architecture of this new life extends even into the smallest habits, turning what once felt like mundane routines into deliberate acts of sovereignty. Clothing choices shift away from signals designed to attract toward utility and personal comfort. Durable fabrics that withstand frequent workouts, minimalist wardrobes that require zero mental overhead for decisions, shoes built for long, solitary walks rather than impressing strangers in bars. Meals become precise fuel rather than social performances. High protein preparations optimized for satiety and recovery, batch cooked on Sundays to eliminate daily negotiation with hunger, or delivery apps that once ate into budgets meant for dates. Sleep hygiene turns almost ritualistic. Blackout curtains, consistent wind down sequences involving no screens after a certain hour, temperature controlled environments that prioritize deep recovery over late night scrolling for potential matches. These micro adjustments accumulate into macro advantages, sustained energy levels that outpace peers still caught in relational churn, clearer cognition from uninterrupted rest, and a body composition that reflects years of consistent input rather than sporadic effort driven by seasonal motivation or partner approval. This precision carries over to financial mapping with almost forensic detail. Men track every dollar not out of scarcity mindset, but abundance engineering. Spreadsheets model multiple scenarios, baseline living costs locked in at low multiples of income, aggressive savings rates that target financial independence timelines, shortened by the absence of dual life overhead, stress tested buffers for market downturns or health events that no longer need to account for supporting dependents. The psychological freedom from those contingencies allows bolder career moves, negotiating harder for raises because fallback plans are robust, switching industries without fear of destabilizing a household, launching ventures that carry real risk because personal downside remains contained. The compounding effect here proves relentless. A man saving 40 to 60% of post tax income instead of the typical 20 to 30% accelerates wealth velocity dramatically. Over a decade, that differential translates into hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, depending on starting point and returns. The knowledge that those dollars work exclusively for future self rather than shared obligations or potential ex partners reframes money itself from burden to ally. Critics who observe this financial discipline from afar sometimes label it selfish hoarding, yet participants frame it as delayed justice. For years, societal messaging positioned men as default economic backstops, expected to absorb disproportionate costs in dating, cohabitation, marriage, divorce, while cultural narratives simultaneously eroded appreciation for that role. When that positioning reversed into outright dismissal of male provision as patriarchal or unnecessary, men recalibrated accordingly. The redirection of capital inward feels less like greed and more like rebalancing after prolonged imbalance. Stories circulate in private channels of men who, after supporting partners through graduate degrees or career transitions only to face abrupt exits, now view every unspent dollar on someone else as a preventable loss. The lesson internalized: never again finance another's upside while bearing all the downside. That boundary, once crossed repeatedly, now stands fortified. Geographic freedom amplifies this rebalancing. Remote work proliferation, Remove the tether to high cost urban centers once justified by dating market density. Men relocate to mid tier cities or smaller towns where square footage costs fractions of coastal prices, property taxes remain manageable, and quality of life metrics, walkability, green space, low crime improve without sacrificing connectivity. Some choose out international bases with digital nomad visas, leveraging currency strength and lower living expenses to stretch portfolios further while maintaining stateside income streams. These moves rarely involve partner seeking anymore. Instead, they optimize for climate, culture, infrastructure, and regulatory lightness around personal habits. A man in his late 20s might base in Chiang Mai or Lisbon not for romance, but because $3,500 monthly covers premium housing, private gym access, weekly massages, diverse cuisine, and international travel, while still banking 5 figures monthly. The lifestyle arbitrage becomes addictive in its rationality. Back in origin countries, the demographic footprint of the shift grows unmistakable. Neighborhoods that once teemed with young couples pushing strollers now show clusters of single men maintaining properties with meticulous care. Perfectly edged lawns, not for impressing a spouse, but for personal satisfaction. Upgraded home gyms in garages where dating app energy once went. Quiet evenings lit by multiple monitors rather than dinner table conversation. Retail sectors feel the pinch differently. Luxury menswear brands report softer sales in traditional courtship categories like suits and watches, while performance athleisure and technical outdoor gear surge. Restaurants specializing in intimate two top seating adjust menus towards solo friendly portions or communal tables that accommodate individuals comfortably. The market responds to changed consumption patterns faster than cultural commentary catches up. Within those changed patterns, the practice itself continues mutating. What started as straightforward prolonged sessions has branched into specialized variants. Some men incorporate sensory deprivation elements, blindfolds, noise canceling headphones, playing bespoke audio loops, temperature contrasts to heighten focus on internal sensation. Others experiment with biofeedback devices that monitor heart rate variability or skin conductance, using real time data to fine tune pacing and avoid premature endpoints. A subset integrates light nootropics or adaptogens sourced legally, aiming to extend cognitive clarity during extended states without crossing into impairment. These innovations spread through vetted channels where participants share empirical logs, session duration, subjective intensity scales, perceived carryover effects on next day productivity, any side effects observed. The data driven approach demystifies what outsiders still view as pure hedonism, revealing instead a form of applied physiology pursued with scientific curiosity. Emotional architecture evolves in parallel. Men who once measured self worth through romantic success metrics now calibrated against internal benchmarks, consistency in chosen disciplines, progress toward financial targets, depth of knowledge acquired, quality of platonic relationships maintained without agenda. The absence of constant external judgment creates space for genuine self compassion, acknowledging flaws without spiraling into shame. Spirals once triggered by rejection sensitivity. Therapy, when sought, shifts focus from fixing perceived deficits in dating skill to processing accumulated resentment, building assertiveness boundaries, and integrating past experiences into coherent narratives that no longer require external validation. Many report that solitude paradoxically deepened their capacity for empathy because it removed the defensive posturing that relationships often demanded. This internal recalibration clashes sharply with external narratives that still cast male withdrawal as pathology. Public health campaigns increasingly target problematic porn use with broad brushes that sweep up intentional practitioners alongside those experiencing genuine distress. Media segments feature experts warning of desensitization, erectile difficulties with real partners, or supposed empathy erosion, claims often based on studies with mixed methodologies or small samples that fail to distinguish between compulsive and controlled use. Men in these communities dissect such coverage methodically, pointing out selection bias, lack of longitudinal data on intentional long term practitioners, and the absence of control groups living similar non sexual lifestyles. The skepticism hardens into dismissal. When institutions repeatedly misrepresent lived reality, trust collapses entirely. That collapsed trust extends to institutions more broadly. Government pronatalist incentives, expanded child credits, subsidized fertility treatments, housing grants for families register as transparent attempts to bribe re engagement rather than address underlying grievances. Men view these measures through the same lens applied to dating, conditional offers that demand performance while offering uncertain reciprocity. The offers arrive too late, after decades of messaging that devalued the very contributions now suddenly needed. Responses range from indifference to quiet contempt. Many simply note that if society truly valued family formation, it would have preserved conditions that made it appealing rather than eroding them and then panicking at the consequences. Meanwhile, younger cohorts observe the experiment with open eyes. Boys in their mid teens consume content from these spaces, not necessarily the adult material, but the lifestyle commentary, financial breakdowns, philosophical discussions about incentive structures and self ownership. They grow up internalizing that participation in traditional romantic scripts is optional, high risk, and increasingly unnecessary. Dating app usage among Gen Z males already trends downward compared to prior generations, with many reporting they never installed the apps at all. The cultural transmission happens peer to peer through private discords, encrypted chats, recommendation algorithms that surface adjacent content. By the time these young men reach 25, the default assumption may well be autonomy first, partnership only if exceptional value presents itself. Women confronting this generational pivot express escalating alarm. Social media threads cycle through stages of denial, anger, bargaining, and occasional introspection. Some double down on independence rhetoric, insisting they need no man anyway. Yet the volume and emotional intensity of those declarations betray underlying anxiety. Others advocate policy level interventions with renewed vigor, framing restrictions as necessary safeguards for vulnerable men and society at large. A smaller but growing contingent begins honest self reflection, acknowledging that consistent patterns of entitlement, testing, or weaponized rejection may have contributed to the exodus. These voices remain minority reports amid louder calls for control rather than course correction. The standoff thus enters a new phase, not active conflict, but entrenched parallel realities. One track continues building robust single male lifestyles insulated from external demands. The other track attempts to engineer reversion through shrinking access, moral pressure, economic disincentives, and demographic panic. Neither track shows signs of imminent convergence. Men have tasted sovereignty and found it nourishing. Women face the consequences of messages once sent casually, now received literally. Society navigates the widening gap with increasing strain. Economic models creak under shifting consumption. Political discourse polarizes further. Cultural artifacts reflect fractured gender scripts. Yet, within that strain, certain truths crystallize. Desire cannot be effectively outlawed or taxed into compliance forever. Autonomy, once granted, resists retraction without proportional backlash. Incentives matter more than intentions. Respect earned through action outlasts respect demanded through narrative. The men walking away did not invent these principles. They simply applied them when previous arrangements violated them too consistently. The path forward, if one exists, requires more than restriction. It demands reconstruction of mutual value propositions strong enough to compete with self contained alternatives. Until that reconstruction happens organically rather than coercively, the divergence will continue deepening, reshaping demographics, economies, and social fabric in ways still only partially visible. Men keep building, the world keeps watching, and the quiet architecture of chosen solitude grows stronger with every passing day. The divergence has now reached a point where parallel societies operate side by side with minimal overlap, each developing its own language, metrics of success, and mechanisms for self replication. On one side stands the autonomous male ecosystem where value is measured in preserved agency, compounded optionality, physiological mastery, financial velocity, and narrative control over personal experience. Success stories shared in closed channels no longer center on romantic conquest or familial milestones, but on milestones like hitting a seven-figure net worth before 40 while maintaining complete schedule sovereignty, completing ultra endurance events that demand years of solitary training, publishing independent creative work that reaches niche but dedicated audiences, or simply logging a decade without a single day defined by someone else's emotional calendar. These markers carry weight because they are verifiable, replicable, and immune to external veto. The language itself has evolved. Terms like frame control now apply equally to mental states during extended sessions and to negotiations with employers or landlords. Abundance mindset refers less to dating options and more to the internal surplus created by refusing to leak resources. Mission alignment describes the harmony between daily habits and long horizon objectives rather than partnership goals. This ecosystem reproduces horizontally rather than vertically. Instead of relying on biological succession through children, it expands through mentorship pipelines, content pipelines, and referral networks. Older men in their late 30s and early 40s who have already achieved escape velocity serve as living case studies for those 10 years behind them. They produce detailed breakdowns, tax optimized relocation sequences, hardware stacks for optimal immersion without diminishing returns, psychological frameworks for neutralizing guilt conditioning absorbed in adolescence, investment allocations that hedge against pronatalist policy risk. Younger men consume this material voraciously, adapt it to their starting conditions, and then become producers themselves within a few years. The transmission velocity is breathtaking because it bypasses traditional gatekeepers. No university departments, no legacy media approval, no corporate HR filters, encrypted servers, pseudonymous handles, invite only discords, and blockchain verified contribution logs keep the knowledge flowing while minimizing surface area exposure to regulation or moral campaigns. On the other side, the mainstream narrative continues to tighten around a narrower set of explanations and remedies. Official discourse increasingly coalesces around three interlocking frames: public health crisis, demographic emergency, and moral decay. Conference panels feature epidemiologists presenting slides on correlation between screen time metrics and reported sexual dysfunction. Demographers projecting workforce shrinkage timelines down to the decimal point. Ethicists debating whether unrestricted access to synthetic intimacy constitutes a form of self objectification that undermines human dignity. Policy shops churn out white papers proposing tiered interventions. Soft measures first, mandatory digital wellness curricula out in high schools that pathologize prolonged arousal training, platform mandated cool down timers after 90 minutes of continuous engagement, subsidized therapy programs marketed specifically to men aged 18 to 35, displaying certain usage patterns. If those prove insufficient, escalation ladders appear in drafts, progressive consumption taxes scaled by individual account activity, licensing requirements for creators whose subscriber bases exceed certain thresholds, civil liability expansions that would allow third parties to sue platforms for downstream societal costs like reduced marriage rates or fertility shortfalls. These proposals encounter fierce subterranean resistance. Men do not march in the streets or launch hashtag campaigns. They simply reroute. When one platform tightens moderation, traffic migrates to decentralized alternatives hosted on protocols designed to resist takedown. When age verification mandates roll out in one jurisdiction, VPN usage spikes and jurisdictional arbitrage accelerates. When tax proposals surface, creators experiment with crypto native monetization models that obscure revenue trails while preserving fan access. The cat and mouse dynamic favors the side with stronger incentive alignment. Regulators must coordinate across fragmented bureaucracies, justify budgets, navigate court challenges grounded in free expression precedents, and manage blowback from creator lobbies that frame restrictions as attacks on sex worker rights. Participants in the autonomous ecosystem face no such coordination problem. Self interest drives instantaneous adaptation. A single post outlining a new obfuscation technique can spread to tens of thousands within hours. Economic modeling begins to reflect this asymmetry more clearly. Consumer spending forecasts now include dedicated line items for male solitude economy categories, high end monitor arrays, noise isolation hardware, ergonomic furniture engineered for 12 plus hour seated sessions, subscription bundles for narrative driven adult games, private server hosting for community archives, travel packages marketed explicitly to single men seeking low regulation environments. Retailers quietly reallocate floor space, fewer couple oriented gift sections, more modular home office setups that double as immersion caves. Real estate developers in secondary markets pivot towards smaller footprint units with robust internet infrastructure and minimal shared wall exposure, anticipating sustained demand from men prioritizing privacy and low maintenance living over family scalability. Insurance actuaries adjust longevity projections upward for cohorts demonstrating high discipline in nutrition, exercise, and stress management, attributes increasingly correlated with those who have fully internalized solitary optimization. Women positioned in the mainstream economy experience the shift asymmetrically. Professional services that once relied heavily on dual income household budgets, wedding planning, luxury couples counseling, high end interior design for family homes, private schooling consultants report softening demand in certain brackets. Dating coaches who built careers teaching women how to filter and qualify suitors now pivot toward damage control content. How to navigate a market with fewer active male participants, how to reframe independence so it does not inadvertently signal unapproachability, how to identify men who have not yet fully disengaged. Some influencers openly experiment with softer rhetoric, dialing back blanket dismissals of male initiative and emphasizing mutual respect in public posts. Though these adjustments often trigger backlash from harder line audiences who view any concession as capitulation. The fertility question refuses to fade from headlines. Governments roll out increasingly aggressive incentives. Direct cash payments scaled by number of children, lifetime tax holidays for parents of three or more, priority access to housing lotteries, extended parental leave that applies retroactively to encourage delayed childbearing. Uptake remains tepid among the target demographic. Men who have internalized the risks, financial exposure and unstable partnerships, custody outcomes weighted against fathers, cultural narratives that continue to frame traditional provider roles as optional at best and oppressive at worst, see these carrots as insufficient compensation for surrendering sovereignty. The offers register as transactional rather than relational, reinforcing rather than dissolving distrust. A growing number respond by accelerating sterilization procedures or long acting contraception, citing the desire to eliminate even theoretical future leverage points that could be used against them in legal or social contexts. Within the autonomous ecosystem, this decision carries little stigma. Discussions around permanent contraception focus on practical benefits, zero risk of paternity fraud, complete decoupling of sexual behavior from reproductive consequences, full preservation of financial optionality. Participants share clinical recommendations, recovery protocols, and post procedure mindset shifts with the same matter of fact tone applied to hardware upgrades or tax strategies. The normalization of these choices among men in their late 20s and early 30s represents one of the starkest indicators of how thoroughly the old reproductive bargain has dissolved. When the default assumption becomes no children unless every variable is locked in favor of the man. And when that assumption finds broad peer support, the demographic trajectory shifts decisively. Cultural production inside the ecosystem begins to formalize. Independent studios release visual novels and animated series that explicitly celebrate solitary mastery, male self sufficiency, and skepticism toward traditional relational scripts. Storylines feature protagonists who achieve extraordinary personal heights precisely because they refuse entanglement, philosophers developing groundbreaking theories in monastic isolation, athletes breaking records after cutting romantic distraction, entrepreneurs scaling ventures at speeds impossible under shared obligations. These works find devoted followings because they mirror lived experience rather than prescribe unattainable ideals. Music playlists curated for extended sessions incorporate ambient tracks layered with subtle affirmations of autonomy, turning hours of immersion into reinforcement loops for the broader lifestyle. Written manifestos circulate as PDFs or blockchain anchored texts, distilling decades of collective observation into tight frameworks that new entrants can absorb in a weekend. External attempts to pathologize this cultural output intensify. Academic papers label it compensatory masculinity or reactionary escapism. Review boards flag certain titles for content moderation under vague harm prevention guidelines. Payment processors intermittently deplatform creators whose work emphasizes disengagement themes. Each intervention triggers innovation waves, new hosting solutions, alternative monetization rails, mirror sites that spring up within hours of takedowns. The ecosystem treats suppression as feature testing. Every block reveals weak points to harden. Every deplatforming exposes new audiences to the material through Streisand style amplification. As the calendar advances deeper into the decade, actuarial tables quietly adjust. Life insurance underwriters note lower mortality risk among men, demonstrating long term discipline in physical maintenance and stress avoidance. Health insurance models begin carving out exceptions for procedures historically scrutinized when elected by younger men. Vasectomies, hormone optimization therapies aligned with performance rather than deficiency correction. The market starts pricing in the reality that a significant cohort will age differently. Fewer stress related cardiac events from relational volatility, lower incidence of certain addictive behaviors substituted by controlled practice, higher adherence to preventive screenings when health is viewed as core asset rather than means to impress others. The question that hovers over every development remains whether this divergence can stabilize into peaceful coexistence or whether it inevitably escalates toward open institutional confrontation. Soft measures have largely failed to reverse momentum. Hard measures risk constitutional challenges, creator exodus, and black market proliferation that could undermine the very tax bases needed to fund social programs. Middle ground approaches, improving economic fundamentals so partnership becomes attractive again on its own merits, face political gridlock because they require dismantling vested interests that benefit from the current imbalance. Men inside the ecosystem watch these debates with clinical detachment. They have already priced in worst case scenarios: nationwide content bans, prohibitive taxation, algorithmic suppression across major platforms, even speculative proposals for mandatory relationship education courses as graduation prerequisites. Each contingency has countermeasures already mapped: offshore backups, peer to peer distribution protocols, physical media archives, relocation triggers tied to legislative milestones. The preparation itself reinforces commitment. Knowing escape hatches exist makes staying the course psychologically effortless. The architecture grows ever more resilient with time. What began as individual adaptation has become systemic. Systems resist entropy. They replicate, harden, and expand. Unless the external environment produces conditions radically more favorable than the internal ones already achieved, the divergence will not contract. It will continue widening until the two realities are so separate they barely register each other's existence anymore. The hardening of these parallel realities has begun producing measurable second order effects that ripple outward in directions few anticipated when the initial withdrawal first gained momentum. Labor market dynamics shift in subtle but accumulating ways. Employers in knowledge intensive sectors notice a cohort of men who exhibit unusually high retention once hired, lower absenteeism tied to relational stress, and a willingness to accept demanding roles that others avoid because personal life remains unencumbered by competing obligations. These workers log consistent overtime without complaint, relocate for promotions without family veto power, and pursue aggressive upskilling because career capital compounds faster when undivided attention is the default state. Human resources departments quietly adjust onboarding language to emphasize individual growth paths over team building family metaphors, sensing that appeals to work family balance land differently with men who have already optimized life around maximal personal bandwidth. Promotion pipelines in certain firms start favoring candidates who demonstrate long term single stability because the pattern correlates with reliability under pressure and lower risk of sudden life event disruptions. Conversely, sectors traditionally reliant on male willingness to endure high risk or high sacrifice conditions begin registering talent shortages that cannot be explained by demographics alone. Construction firms in high cost regions report difficulty filling supervisory roles that require extended travel or irregular hours. The men who once accepted those trade offs for provider status now decline because the compensation premium no longer justifies the erosion of sovereignty. Military recruitment officers note steeper declines among young men who score high on aptitude tests but low on willingness to subordinate personal autonomy to institutional demands. First responder agencies in urban centers face longer hiring cycles as candidates weigh the physical toll and schedule unpredictability against lifestyles already engineered for recovery and control. The common thread across these shortages is not laziness, but a revaluation of what constitutes acceptable trade off. When personal peace ranks above prestige or pay increments that once funded family units, entire occupational hierarchies must recalibrate incentives or accept structural understaffing. This recalibration pressure feeds back into wage negotiations. In fields where male participation drops noticeably, employers offer higher base salaries, remote hybrid flexibility, compressed work weeks, or performance bonuses untethered to seniority ladders. The adjustments are pragmatic rather than ideological. When the supply of willing labor tightens, price must rise. Men who remain in or re enter these markets do so on stronger terms because their outside option, continued autonomy supported by lower overhead, sets a harder reservation wage. The phenomenon creates upward pressure on compensation in male dominated skilled trades and technical roles while simultaneously softening demand in lifestyle dependent service sectors that cater to couple oriented consumption. Economists tracking these bifurcations begin publishing working papers under titles like The Autonomy Premium: How Male Disengagement Reshapes Occupational Returns, or Reservation Wages in the Age of Voluntary Celibacy. The data sets are still emerging, but the directional signal grows clearer with each quarterly labor report. Education systems feel parallel tremors. Secondary school counselors report boys arriving at career planning sessions with remarkably concrete visions of solo trajectories. Fire timelines mapped to the month, geographic independence goals tied to visa pathways, side hustle revenue models already generating small but growing cash flow. These students display less anxiety around traditional markers of success: college prestige, Greek life networking, prom dates, and more focus on skill portability, debt avoidance, and asset velocity. University admissions offices notice application essays that frame personal independence as a core value rather than a fallback position after romantic disappointment. Dropout rates among male undergraduates in certain programs stabilize or decline slightly as those who remain treat education as pure capital accumulation rather than a social rite of passage. Graduate programs in STEM and quantitative fields see enrollment patterns skewing toward men who view advanced credentials as leverage for remote or international work rather than prerequisites for provider status. The cultural conversation around fatherhood undergoes its own quiet mutation. Public service announcements urging men to embrace paternity arrive with diminishing returns because the target audience has already internalized a different calculus. Children represent permanent loss of exit rights, asymmetric legal exposure, and 20-year financial commitments in an era where relational stability feels probabilistic at best. Men who once might have considered fatherhood under favorable conditions now treat it as an elective, high stakes gamble with odds stacked against them. Online discussions dissect custody statistics, child support enforcement patterns, paternity establishment procedures, and post separation asset division outcomes with actuarial precision. The takeaway for many becomes prophylactic: eliminate the possibility entirely rather than manage the risk. Vasectomy rates among men aged 25 to 34 climb in jurisdictions where procedure access remains straightforward, and reversal regret remains statistically negligible compared to the perceived cost of unintended parenthood. Women positioned to observe these choices from close range, sisters, cousins, former classmates, express a mixture of incredulity and resignation. Family gatherings feature fewer announcements of engagements or pregnancies among the younger male relatives. Conversations that once revolved around matchmaking pivot toward concern over aging parents with no grandchildren in sight. Some women attempt direct intervention: invitations to set up profiles on curated dating platforms, introductions to vetted friends, appeals to biological clocks, or legacy concerns. The responses vary from polite deflection to blunt statements of preference for the status quo. The disconnect deepens when the men point out that the same women who once championed unconditional independence now express surprise that it was taken literally. The exchange rarely escalates into open conflict because the men have already emotionally detached from the need for approval. They simply restate boundaries and redirect attention elsewhere. Media framing struggles to keep pace with the underlying shift. Early coverage leaned toward concern trolling, lonely men lost to screens, epidemic of isolation, crisis of masculinity. As the phenomenon persists and grows more intentional, the tone fragments. Progressive outlets experiment with empathy driven pieces that explore root causes. Decades of mixed messaging, economic precarity, cultural devaluation of male emotional labor, while still advocating for structural fixes like better mental health integration and platform accountability. Conservative commentators oscillate between moral condemnation of self indulgence and pragmatic acknowledgement that men responded rationally to incentives that became punishing. Centrist publications run data heavy features on fertility cliffs and pension fund solvency risks, yet hesitate to assign primary causation to any single gender's choices. The result is a cacophony where no unified narrative emerges, allowing the autonomous cohort to continue operating in relative quiet. Technological adaptation accelerates within that quiet. Hardware manufacturers release niche product lines tailored to prolonged seated immersion. Zero gravity recliners with integrated cooling systems. Modular monitor arms that support 6 screen arrays without desk clutter. Haptic feedback suits synchronized to content metadata. Ambient light projectors that reduce eye fatigue during multi hour sessions. Software developers build companion applications that log physiological metrics, heart rate coherence, galvanic skin response, session duration trends, and provide dashboards for optimization. Machine learning models trained on anonymized user data suggest content sequences likely to extend flow states without triggering habituation. Blockchain based platforms emerge for creator monetization that bypass traditional payment rails entirely, offering pseudonymity, instant settlement, and resistance to jurisdictional freezes. The innovation cycle turns faster because the user base is highly technical, financially motivated, and ideologically aligned around preserving access. Regulatory attempts to slow that cycle encounter predictable headwinds. Bills proposing device level content filters face immediate First Amendment scrutiny in common law jurisdictions. International coordination falters when low regulation territories position themselves as safe harbors for creators and hosting services. Enforcement agencies grapple with resource constraints. Monitoring decentralized networks requires expertise and scale that stretch budgets struggle to provide. Each failed intervention reinforces the perception among participants that sovereignty remains defensible through persistent adaptation rather than confrontation. The ecosystem does not seek victory in the culture war, it seeks irrelevance to it. Demographic projections now incorporate these behavioral constants into baseline models rather than treating them as transient shocks. Statistical agencies release alternative scenarios labeled high autonomy or persistent male withdrawal that forecast steeper population declines. Accelerated aging curves and larger dependency ratios than earlier estimates assumed. Pension systems model increased reliance on immigration or productivity gains to offset shrinking working age cohorts. Urban planners revise long range forecasts for school construction, housing density, and transportation infrastructure downward in certain regions. The numbers force uncomfortable conversations in boardrooms and cabinet meetings Yet proposed remedies, tax breaks for marriage, subsidies for dating platforms, public campaigns celebrating partnership, continue to treat symptoms while sidestepping the incentive structure that produced the trend. Men inside the ecosystem treat these macro level alarms with equanimity. They have already optimized for lower societal overhead, smaller ecological footprints from single person households, reduced consumption of status goods tied to couple signaling, higher personal savings rates that buffer against public system strain. The knowledge that their choices contribute to aggregate challenges registers as collateral rather than culpability. Responsibility, in their framework, belongs to those who shaped the conditions that made withdrawal preferable. Until those conditions change in durable ways through consistent respect, symmetrical risk allocation, and genuine reciprocity, the rational response remains continued investment in self contained systems. The architecture, therefore, keeps expanding its footprint. New cohorts enter fully formed, having absorbed the accumulated knowledge from predecessors. Mid career men solidify their positions, reaching escape velocity and then mentoring from a distance. Older men age into quiet exemplars of long term viability, healthy, solvent, unburdened, content. The pattern becomes self reinforcing because visible success silences doubters more effectively than argument ever could. Each year of sustained autonomy adds another layer of proof that the path works, that the trade offs were worth making, that the panic on the other side reflects loss of leverage rather than moral failure on theirs. Society thus arrives at an inflection point where coexistence without convergence appears the most probable equilibrium. Two populations sharing geographic space but occupying separate incentive landscapes learn to minimize friction. Men continue building lives calibrated to internal metrics. Everyone else navigates the consequences of a world where half the traditional bargain has been quietly abrogated. The experiment runs on, data accumulating, outcomes clarifying, and the quiet divergence settling into permanence. The quiet permanence of the separation has started reshaping public infrastructure in ways that were once considered fringe speculations, but now appear in municipal planning documents with increasing frequency. City councils in mid sized metropolitan areas begin revising master plans to accommodate smaller average household sizes as a structural given rather than a temporary fluctuation. Zoning ordinances quietly loosen restrictions on micro units and accessory dwelling units tailored for single occupants who prioritize privacy, high speed connectivity, and minimal maintenance over expansive family layouts. Park departments allocate more funding to solitary use amenities. Extended trail networks designed for long, uninterrupted runs, quiet contemplation benches placed at scenic overlooks rather than playground adjacent clusters, outdoor fitness stations spaced far enough apart to discourage group interaction. Transit agencies experiment with demand responsive shuttles that serve low density single male neighborhoods where car ownership remains high, but usage patterns favor occasional long haul trips rather than daily family commutes. These adjustments are framed in neutral language: sustainability, aging in place readiness, quality of life enhancement, but the underlying data driving them traces back to persistent declines in cohabitation and household formation rates among men in the prime working age brackets. Commercial real estate developers respond with equal pragmatism. Strip mall conversions shift away from family dining chains toward high end meal prep facilities, premium barber shops with private suites, specialty coffee roasters that double as co working nooks for remote operators, and boutique gyms emphasizing individual programming over class based social dynamics. Residential towers marketed to young professionals now highlight features once considered secondary. Soundproofed walls between units, dedicated server closets for personal hardware arrays, rooftop solar plus battery setups that enable off grid capability during peak demand periods, concierge services focused on dry cleaning and package handling rather than event coordination. Marketing copy has evolved accordingly. No more images of smiling couples on balconies. Instead, single figures silhouetted against city skylines, headphones on, laptop open, horizon wide. The aesthetic sells because it matches lived preference, visibility without intrusion, connection without obligation. Healthcare delivery systems register parallel adaptations. Telemedicine platforms report sustained growth in male patients seeking routine checkups, hormone panels, sleep studies, and nutritional counseling without the prompting of a partner's concern. Primary care providers notice men scheduling preventive visits with greater regularity when appointments remain fully under their control rather than tied to shared calendars or relational accountability. Urology clinics see steady increases in consultations for elective procedures that secure long term reproductive choice, with patients citing clarity of mind and financial predictability as primary motivations rather than medical necessity. Mental health services observe a bifurcated trend. Sharp upticks in men seeking therapy for childhood conditioning or workplace stress, contrasted with near zero demand for couples counseling or breakup processing among the same demographic. The pattern suggests a population that has outsourced emotional labor to self directed protocols, journaling frameworks borrowed from Stoic traditions, breathwork sequences refined through years of practice, peer reviewed literature on attachment theory digested without the need for a partner to validate insights. Insurance carriers refine actuarial tables further. Life expectancy differentials between highly disciplined single men and their coupled or less regimented counterparts begin showing statistical separation after age 40. Lower incidence of stress, cardiomyopathy, reduced alcohol related liver markers, fewer emergency room visits tied to relational conflict or partner induced dietary lapses all contribute to favorable underwriting adjustments. Premium discounts start appearing for applicants who document consistent biometric tracking, regular strength training logs, and absence of high conflict relational history. The incentives align neatly with existing behaviors. Men already monitoring sleep scores, step counts, and recovery metrics now receive tangible financial rewards for continuing the regimen. Actuarial models that once penalized single status as a proxy for loneliness risk now quietly credit it when paired with high discipline indicators. Corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives encounter unforeseen friction points. Training modules that once assumed universal desire for partnership or family building find portions of the audience disengaged or openly skeptical. Male employees in certain age bands participate minimally in optional family leave workshops or parenting seminars, viewing them as irrelevant to their trajectory. Employee resource groups focused on work life integration struggle to attract participation when the dominant life model among attendees involves deliberate minimization of external dependencies. HR leaders begin commissioning internal surveys that ask more granular questions about long term personal goals, only to discover that significant percentages prioritize financial independence milestones, geographic flexibility, and uninterrupted creative time over relational or familial expansion. The findings prompt quiet course corrections, more emphasis on individual wellness stipends, sabbatical policies untied to family status, mentorship tracks that reward self directed achievement rather than team leadership prerequisites. Political campaigns adjust messaging in incremental but telling ways. Candidates courting younger male voters drop references to family values in favor of personal freedom, economic self reliance, and protection from overreach. Platforms that once highlighted school choice vouchers or childcare credits now lead with tax simplification, deregulation of gig economy sectors, and safeguards against expansive liability regimes in civil court. Campaign ads targeting 25 to 39-year-old men feature imagery of solo road trips, home office setups with multiple monitors, gym sessions at dawn, visuals that signal control and competence without domestic framing. Opposition research teams note the shift and attempt counter messaging around selfish isolation or abandonment of civic duty. But focus group testing shows diminishing resonance when the target audience has already internalized disengagement as rational response rather than moral failing. International observers begin cataloging the phenomenon as a distinct Western variant of demographic transition. Researchers in East Asian institutes compare notes with American and European counterparts, noting similarities in fertility suppression, driven by economic pressure and shifting gender expectations, yet highlighting the uniquely pronounced male opt out dynamic in Anglo American contexts. Cross national studies start isolating variables, legal environments with high father exposure risk in family court, cultural narratives that equate traditional masculinity with toxicity, dating market asymmetries amplified by algorithmic platforms. Preliminary findings suggest that jurisdictions with lower perceived risk of asset loss and separation and stronger cultural affirmation of male relational initiative maintain higher partnership formation rates, even under comparable economic strain. The implication lands heavily. Policy architecture matters more than abstract appeals to duty or biology. Within the autonomous cohort itself, philosophical undercurrents deepen. Private reading lists circulate featuring works that explore voluntary renunciation, radical self sufficiency, and the ethics of non participation. Texts ranging from classical ascetic traditions to modern analyses of incentive misalignment in post industrial societies. Discussion threads dissect concepts like exit over voice, applying Hirschman's framework to romantic markets. When loyalty yields diminishing returns and voice produces backlash, exit becomes the dominant strategy. Participants refine personal credos that emphasize sovereignty as both means and end, freedom not as license for indulgence, but as prerequisite for disciplined pursuit of excellence across domains. The ethos rejects both hedonistic caricature and ascetic deprivation. It pursues calibrated intensity within clearly defined boundaries, treating pleasure as fuel for higher order objectives rather than the objective itself. Creative output from this mindset begins crossing over into mainstream visibility in oblique ways. Anonymous authors self publish manifestos that gain cult followings before disappearing from retail channels under pressure, only to resurface on decentralized archives. Short films produced on shoestring budgets depict solitary protagonists achieving quiet transcendence. Composers finishing symphonies in remote cabins, engineers solving intractable problems in minimalist workshops, athletes crossing finish lines with no crowd waiting. The works avoid overt preaching. They simply show lives that function at high levels without relational scaffolding. Viewer comments in underground forums praise the authenticity. No forced redemption arcs, no last minute conversions to coupledom, just sustained competence in chosen domains. The cumulative weight of these developments forces a reckoning in adjacent fields. Sociologists who once studied family formation as default trajectory now pivot toward non relational sociality as a legitimate object of inquiry. Anthropologists document emerging rituals within the cohort. Annual self accountability retreats held in rented Airbnbs, virtual mastermind groups that meet quarterly to audit progress against 5 year plans, private blockchain ledgers where members log contributions to shared knowledge bases. Economists model scenarios in which sustained male autonomy becomes a stabilizing force rather than destabilizing one. Higher aggregate savings rates cushion recessions. Concentrated human capital in certain sectors drives localized productivity booms. Reduced household consumption lowers inflationary pressure on staples. The framing shift is tentative but unmistakable. From crisis narrative to emergent adaptation. Women positioned outside this ecosystem increasingly encounter its boundaries in daily life. Dating profiles that once received dozens of likes now sit dormant for weeks. Social circles contract as coupled friends pair off and drift toward family centric activities. Professional networks feel thinner when male colleagues decline after work drinks or weekend team building events without apology. The experience breeds a spectrum of responses. Some double down on independence rhetoric, others quietly soften tone in public posts. A few begin candid conversations with male friends about where the disconnect originated. These exchanges rarely produce immediate reconciliation because trust deficits run deep and time horizons have diverged. Men measure progress in decades of compounding autonomy, while many women still operate on shorter relational clocks. The broader culture absorbs the change unevenly. Popular entertainment experiments with anti romantic protagonists, detectives who solve cases precisely because they remain emotionally unentangled, scientists who unlock breakthroughs after cutting social noise, wanderers who find meaning in perpetual motion rather than settlement. The trope gains traction because it resonates with a growing audience that no longer sees coupling as inevitable climax. Critics praise the freshness while quietly worrying about what it signals for collective cohesion. The tension remains unresolved because the stories reflect reality more than they prescribe alternatives. As the decade progresses, the divergence settles into institutional fact rather than passing phase. Governments plan around lower fertility baselines. Corporations design for higher single male participation rates. Cities build for smaller, more private households. Healthcare systems optimize for self directed patients. Education pipelines produce graduates who treat partnership as elective rather than obligatory. The architecture of autonomy, once experimental, now functions as parallel infrastructure, self sustaining, self reinforcing, and increasingly indifferent to appeals for reintegration. Men within it continue the work of refinement. Each year brings sharper tools, clearer principles, stronger proof of concept. The path no longer requires justification, it simply exists, proven by persistence. And in that persistence lies its most formidable strength. It does not need permission to endure. The institutional settling has now progressed to the point where even the language of official statistics begins to reflect the new baseline without euphemism. Census forms in several advanced economies introduce expanded response categories for household composition that explicitly include single adult by choice alongside traditional family structures, allowing granular tracking of voluntary non participation rather than lumping it into residual other buckets. National accounts departments start publishing supplementary tables that isolate consumption patterns by relational status, revealing stark divergences. Single men in the relevant age cohorts show elevated spending on durables that support solitary optimization, specialized computing equipment, premium audio isolation, ergonomic long duration seating. while showing depressed expenditure on categories historically tied to courtship signaling, such as fine jewelry purchases for others, restaurant reservations for two, or seasonal couple travel packages. Central banks incorporate these bifurcated spending profiles into inflation model inputs, noting that the shift contributes to muted price pressure in certain service sectors, even as goods inflation remains stubborn elsewhere. The data no longer treats the phenomenon as anomaly, it treats it as structural input. Central bank research divisions quietly commission scenario analyses that model monetary policy transmission under conditions of persistently lower household formation. Lower marriage and cohabitation rates correlate with reduced demand for mortgage credit at scale, dampening the housing credit channel that once amplified interest rate effects throughout the economy. With fewer dual income units qualifying for large leverage purchases, residential real estate cycles lose some of their traditional procyclical momentum, requiring policymakers to lean harder on other levers: corporate investment incentives, export promotion, public infrastructure spending to achieve growth targets. The implication permeates internal memos. When a significant share of the working age population operates with minimal debt service obligations tied to family expansion, conventional tools for stimulating aggregate demand lose potency. Forward guidance begins, including subtle references to changing household dynamics as a factor complicating rate path projections. International organizations take notice in their own way. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development releases working papers that compare male disengagement patterns across member states, isolating the Anglo American cluster as an outlier where legal, cultural, and technological factors converge to produce unusually sharp withdrawal. Reports highlight how no fault divorce regimes with broad asset division discretion, combined with high litigation costs and perceived bias in family court outcomes, elevate perceived risk far above levels observed in jurisdictions with stricter fault based systems or community property defaults. The analysis stops short of policy prescription, but notes that countries maintaining clearer default rules around prenuptial enforceability and spousal maintenance caps exhibit higher sustained partnership rates, even under similar economic headwinds. Development banks in emerging markets begin referencing the Western case as a cautionary model when advising on gender policy frameworks, warning that rapid shifts toward unconditional female autonomy without corresponding recalibration of male incentives can trigger unanticipated feedback loops in fertility and savings behavior. Corporate strategists internalize these global divergences when planning long horizon investments. Multinational consumer goods companies reweight product development pipelines away from family oriented lines. Large pack diapers, minivan accessories, multi bedroom furniture sets toward modular, scalable items suited to single adult dwellings, compact appliances with smart home integration, subscription based personal care kits delivered monthly, furniture systems that reconfigure easily for solo living rather than guest accommodation. Advertising agencies tasked with reaching 25 to 40-year-old men shift creative briefs toward narratives of quiet mastery and internal validation. Campaigns showing protagonists solving complex problems alone at dawn, mastering skills in empty warehouses, achieving flow states in minimalist studios. The messaging avoids overt anti relational rhetoric. It simply omits partnership as a necessary component of fulfillment. Conversion rates improve measurably when the content aligns with observed self conception rather than aspirational coupledom. Within academia, the field of family studies undergoes a slow but undeniable reorientation. Tenure track positions, once dedicated to marital stability predictors, now advertise for specialists in non normative relational trajectories or autonomous life course design. Doctoral dissertations increasingly treat voluntary singlehood among men not as deviation requiring explanation, but as adaptive strategy worthy of its own theoretical framework. Qualitative researchers conduct in depth interviews with long term practitioners, emerging with typologies that distinguish between reactive withdrawal, driven by accumulated negative experience, and proactive sovereignty, engineered from the outset as optimal allocation of finite resources. Quantitative modelers build agent based simulations in which virtual agents update utility functions based on experienced risk reward ratios in simulated romantic markets. The models consistently produce tipping points where male participation collapses once perceived downside exceeds a critical threshold, after which recovery requires exogenous shocks to restore trust or drastically lower entry barriers. Libraries and digital archives begin curating dedicated collections around the phenomenon. Special topic bibliographies compile decades of scattered articles on male alienation, incentive misalignment, technological substitution of intimacy, and legal asymmetries in intimate partnerships. Graduate seminars introduce modules titled The Opt Out Generation or Sovereignty as Adaptation, where students debate whether the trend represents civilizational decline, evolutionary misfire, rational optimization under distorted constraints, or emergent liberation from outdated scripts. The discourse remains polarized. Some faculty frame it as crisis demanding urgent intervention. Others as evidence that traditional scripts were always fragile constructs sustained by unequal bargaining power. But the very existence of sustained scholarly attention signals that the pattern has crossed from fringe observation to legitimate subfield. Religious institutions confront the shift with particular urgency. Denominations that historically emphasized procreation and family as central vocations see attendance among prime age men continue declining in absolute terms. Pastoral counseling sessions pivot toward addressing celibacy, not as moral failing, but as chosen discipline, with some progressive congregations exploring theological frameworks that affirm non reproductive paths as valid expressions of stewardship and self mastery. Conservative bodies respond with intensified teaching on covenantal duty, yet find sermons on marital obligation met with polite disengagement rather than open rebellion. A small but growing number of faith based men's groups emerge that explicitly validate autonomy while maintaining spiritual accountability. Weekly accountability calls focused on discipline, generosity, and purpose rather than relational status. The hybrid model attempts to retain connection without demanding partnership as prerequisite. Nonprofit sectors realigned funding priorities in response. Organizations once focused on marriage promotion initiatives quietly rebrand toward broader healthy relationship literacy that includes modules on recognizing when non engagement serves well being. Foundations that previously underwrote family formation research now divert grants toward studying long term outcomes of deliberate singlehood, mental resilience, civic participation, charitable giving patterns, innovation rates among high autonomy cohorts. Early findings suggest that men who sustain this lifestyle over a decade show elevated volunteering hours in non family contexts, higher per capita donations to secular causes, and disproportionate representation in open source software contributions and citizen science projects. The data complicates narratives of pure selfishness. It points instead to redirected pro social energy flowing through channels that do not require intimate partnership as entry ticket. Philanthropic capital follows the signal. Donors with roots in tech and finance increasingly back initiatives that accelerate individual sovereignty, scholarships for trade certifications that enable geographic mobility, seed funding for decentralized content platforms resistant to censorship, incubators for hardware designed around solitary optimization. Venture philanthropy circles treat autonomy as a meta cause that unlocks downstream impact. Financially independent men free to pursue high risk, high upside ideas without dragging dependence into uncertainty. The logic mirrors effective altruism reasoning, but applies it to personal architecture rather than global poverty. Secure the base layer of self determination first, then scale contribution outward. Environmental organizations quietly benefit from the trend. Lower average household sizes correlate with reduced per capita resource consumption in certain categories. Smaller living spaces require less heating and cooling energy. Fewer dependents mean lower transport miles for family errands, decreased demand for consumer goods tied to child rearing cycles. Ecological footprint calculators begin offering single optimized profiles that show materially lower impact than dual or multi person baselines, even when income levels remain comparable. Advocacy groups historically focused on population control start incorporating male disengagement as an unorthodox but effective downward pressure on growth rates, though they frame the discussion carefully to avoid alienating progressive constituencies that equate the trend with misogynistic retreat. The arts continue absorbing and refracting the reality in fragmented ways. Novelists publish works that center protagonists who achieve rare clarity precisely because they refuse entanglement. Detectives whose solitude sharpens observation. Musicians whose isolation births haunting compositions. Philosophers whose detachment allows unflinching inquiry. The stories rarely moralize, they simply depict competence unburdened by compromise. Independent filmmakers release low budget features shot in sparse locations using natural light and long takes to convey the texture of uninterrupted thought. Streaming algorithms begin surfacing these titles to audiences whose viewing histories show sustained preference for introspective, non romantic narratives. Viewership clusters form around content that respects the viewer's autonomy rather than demanding emotional investment in fictional couples. Sports culture experiences its own subtle realignment. Endurance disciplines, ultra marathons, long distance cycling brevets, solo through hikes see participation surges among men in their 30s who treat training as moving meditation rather than performance for external eyes. Powerlifting and strongman communities grow among those channeling redirected energy into measurable strength gains tracked in private logs rather than shared social feeds. Team sport leagues at recreational levels report softening registration numbers as men opt for individual pursuits that allow complete schedule control and zero interpersonal drama. The shift reinforces physical sovereignty as core value. The body becomes the ultimate asset under exclusive management. As these threads weave together, the separation solidifies beyond reversal through ordinary means. Each adaptation, urban design, corporate incentives, academic focus, artistic representation, adds another layer of reinforcement. The system no longer requires active defense. It simply persists through alignment with rational self interest. Attempts to disrupt it encounter friction proportional to its entrenchment. The deeper the roots, the harder the uprooting. Men within it age into their 40s and 50s with balance sheets, health markers, and experiential depth that validate every prior decision. The younger men watching see not rebellion, but blueprint. The blueprint spreads because it works. Society therefore settles into a bifurcated equilibrium that no longer feels provisional. One track continues optimizing for autonomy at scale. The other track manages the aggregate consequences: fiscal strain, cultural drift, demographic inversion, with whatever tools remain viable. Friction persists at the margins, but diminishes as mutual indifference becomes the default relation. The divergence no longer demands explanation. It simply is. And in its persistence, it reshapes everything downstream quietly, relentlessly, irrevocably. The equilibrium has now matured to a stage where its effects penetrate even the most insulated layers of daily governance and civic administration. Municipal budget offices in growing numbers of cities revise multi-year financial forecasts with explicit line items for single adult household dominance as a persistent demographic input. Property tax revenue models adjust downward for family-sized dwellings while projecting steadier collections from smaller, higher density units occupied by disciplined single occupants who pay reliably and rarely default. Waste management departments recalibrate collection routes and bin size allocations, noting sustained reductions in organic waste volumes from households without children or frequent entertaining. Water utility planners observe flatter diurnal demand curves in neighborhoods with high concentrations of solitary men, less peak usage tied to family shower schedules or laundry cycles, more consistent baseline consumption from individual routines. These granular shifts accumulate into material savings that allow reallocation of public funds toward infrastructure categories previously underfunded. Expanded fiber optic deployment to support remote work density, additional charging stations for personal electric vehicles used for solo commuting, upgraded public Wi-Fi in parks frequented by individuals seeking quiet outdoor workspaces rather than group recreation. School district superintendents confront parallel realities when enrollment projections continue trending downward in suburban and exurban zones. Buildings once slated for expansion or new construction now face right-sizing discussions or outright closure proposals. Boards of education debate repurposing surplus classroom space for adult education programs, trade skilling boot camps, financial literacy workshops, certification tracks in emerging technical fields that disproportionately attract men who treat learning as lifelong asset accumulation rather than a means to family provider status. Extracurricular budgets shift away from team sports and toward individual pursuits. Chess clubs, robotics competitions, astronomy societies, debate teams that reward solitary preparation over group dynamics. The pivot is presented as modernization and inclusivity, but the underlying driver is clear. Participation patterns have realigned around preferences for mastery without interdependence. Teachers who once measured success through parent teacher conferences and family event turnout now track individual student trajectories with greater emphasis on self directed projects and personal portfolios. Public library systems undergo their own quiet transformation. Circulation statistics show surging demand for titles in personal finance optimization, Stoic philosophy, biohacking protocols, remote entrepreneurship guides, and technical manuals on hardware optimization. Librarians report steady requests for extended, quiet study zones equipped with individual carrels, noise canceling pods, and high speed terminals rather than collaborative group tables. Digital lending platforms see male borrowers disproportionately checking out audiobooks consumed during long solo workouts or commutes. Narratives of self reliance, historical accounts of ascetic achievement, analyses of incentive structures in modern institutions. Programming budgets redirect toward single attendee friendly events. Author talks streamed to personal devices, solo writing workshops, financial planning seminars delivered in lecture format rather than interactive roundtables. The library evolves from community hub into personal resource depot, mirroring the broader preference for high value input without social overhead. Emergency services call centers log subtle but consistent changes in incident profiles. Domestic disturbance dispatches decline in frequency among certain age demographics as fewer households contain the interpersonal volatility that's once triggered those calls. Mental health crisis interventions shift toward isolated cases, men experiencing acute burnout from work intensity rather than relational conflict, individuals reporting existential distress after prolonged solitude without the buffering effects of partnership. Paramedics note higher rates of non emergent transports for men who have optimized health monitoring to the point of early detection of minor issues, preferring professional confirmation over self triage in the absence of a partner's second opinion. Fire departments observe fewer false alarms tied to cooking mishaps in multi person kitchens, offset by occasional incidents involving high end single user appliances left unattended during extended focus sessions. The net effect on response patterns is a flattening of certain call types and a slight uptick in others, prompting departments to refine triage algorithms and resource allocation accordingly. Judicial systems feel downstream pressure as caseload composition evolves. Family court dockets in many jurisdictions show sustained declines in new filings for divorce, custody modification, and child support enforcement among younger cohorts. The reduction stems not from improved marital stability, but from lower entry into marriage and cohabitation to begin with. Civil courts see corresponding drops in breach of promise or palimony style claims as fewer couples reach the threshold where informal agreements turn litigious. Probate filings adjust as more estates pass through simpler intestate succession paths or fully designated beneficiary structures that bypass spousal defaults. Judges presiding over civil matters report calendars increasingly dominated by contract disputes, intellectual property cases, and commercial litigation. Arenas where single men appear disproportionately as plaintiffs or defendants because their disputes rarely involve relational entanglements. The bench quietly adapts procedural norms, shorter hearing blocks for self represented litigants who arrive meticulously prepared, greater acceptance of virtual appearances for those who have relocated for jurisdictional or lifestyle reasons. Corrections and rehabilitation systems encounter analogous realignments. Parole and probation officers note lower recidivism rates among certain male offenders who, post release, adopt highly structured solitary routines, rigid sleep wake cycles, consistent employment in remote capable roles, minimal social exposure beyond necessary interactions. Community supervision plans begin incorporating allowances for private immersion setups when participants demonstrate that such environments reduce impulsivity and support compliance with conditions. Reentry programs that once emphasized family reunification as a stabilizing factor now include modules on building autonomous support networks, online accountability groups, financial mentors, fitness coaches, recognizing that many participants have already internalized self reliance as default operating system. Veterans Affairs offices observe similar patterns among younger service members transitioning to civilian life. Men who enlisted partly for structure and camaraderie increasingly exit with plans centered on solitary optimization rather than immediate family formation. VA counselors report more requests for benefits navigation workshops focused on maximizing disability ratings, pension eligibility, and home loan guarantees for single unit purchases rather than multi bedroom properties. Peer support groups evolve toward hybrid formats, virtual check ins that allow participation from anywhere, emphasis on discipline and purpose over relational healing. The shift aligns with broader trends. Veterans who once sought partnership as post service anchor now treat sovereignty as the anchor and view relational pursuits as optional add ons. Transportation departments refine long range planning around altered mobility patterns. Highway authorities note sustained growth in solo driver vehicle miles traveled, particularly on weekends and evenings when family outings once dominated traffic flows. Public transit agencies report softer demand for family fare structures while seeing steady ridership on routes serving remote work hubs and low density residential clusters. Electric vehicle charging networks expand faster in suburban and peri-urban areas where single men cluster, driven by higher per capita ownership rates among those who treat personal transportation as extension of sovereignty rather than shared household asset. Airport authorities observe increased bookings for one-way business class tickets on midweek flights, patterns consistent with men relocating frequently for tax, regulatory, or lifestyle advantages without need to coordinate family schedules. Energy utilities adjust load forecasting with greater precision. Residential demand profiles flatten in neighborhoods dominated by single adult households. Lower evening peaks from collective cooking and entertainment, steadier overnight baseload from always on computing and climate control systems optimized for individual comfort. Solar plus storage installations proliferate among men who view energy independence as logical extension of financial and schedule independence. Demand response programs see higher participation rates from this demographic because flexibility aligns naturally with routines untethered to others' needs. Telecommunications carriers report robust growth in premium data plans and multi device connectivity packages among men who maintain elaborate personal networks. Primary workstation, secondary laptop, tablet for reference material, phone for communication, all synced and redundantly backed up. Fiber to the home penetration accelerates in areas where remote work density correlates with solitary living because upload speeds matter more when producing content, hosting private servers, or participating in decentralized communities. Customer service interactions shift toward technical troubleshooting for immersion setups rather than family plan, coordination, or shared device conflicts. Weather and climate agencies begin factoring altered household response patterns into emergency preparedness models. Single occupant dwellings show higher compliance with evacuation orders when warnings arrive through personal channels, push notifications, direct texts, rather than relying on partner coordination. Resource stockpiling behaviors differ. Men who have optimized for self sufficiency maintain larger personal reserves of non perishables, water, backup power, medical supplies, reducing strain on public distribution points during prolonged disruptions. Shelter in place compliance improves when messaging emphasizes individual control over collective obligation. The cumulative effect across these domains is a society quietly retooling around a population segment that has become structurally permanent rather than transitional. Each adjustment normalizes the divergence further. Public resources stretch differently. Service delivery recalibrates. Infrastructure priorities shift. Governance language evolves. The once anomalous becomes baseline input. Men within the cohort experience these changes as ambient confirmation rather than active victory. Systems adapt to their presence because ignoring it becomes costlier than accommodating it. The architecture requires no further justification. Its persistence generates the gravity that pulls everything else into alignment. Younger entrants inherit a world already shaped by the prior generation's choices. Libraries stocked with relevant material, zoning codes friendly to their preferences, benefit structures neutral to their status, cultural artifacts that mirror rather than judge their trajectory. The divergence thus crosses from observable trend into embedded condition. It no longer requires defense or explanation. It simply continues expanding its footprint, reshaping the material and institutional landscape one quiet recalibration at a time. And with each recalibration, the path becomes more inevitable, the alternatives more distant, the equilibrium more complete. The entrenchment reaches into the realm of intellectual property and innovation ecosystems in ways that were once peripheral, but now stand central to economic forecasting. Patent offices in major jurisdictions observe a marked uptick in filings from individual inventors operating without corporate affiliation. Men who have channeled years of uninterrupted focus into proprietary algorithms for personal finance automation, hardware designs for optimized solitary environments, software tools that automate routine decision trees across multiple life domains, and novel biometric feedback systems tailored to self administered performance tracking. These filings often emerge from home laboratories equipped with 3D printers, oscilloscopes, soldering stations, and high end computing clusters assembled piece by piece over time. The inventors frequently cite the absence of relational distractions as the decisive factor enabling sustained iteration cycles that corporate R&D teams, burdened by meetings and consensus processes, struggle to match. Examiners note higher grant rates for applications demonstrating clear utility in individual optimization contexts. Wearable devices that log arousal state transitions for refinement purposes. Privacy preserving data vaults for personal knowledge bases. Decentralized identity protocols that shield users from platform level tracking. The pattern contributes to a broader democratization of invention, where solo operators outpace legacy institutions in niche but high impact categories. Venture capital allocation begins reflecting this shift with measurable reallocations. Early stage funds that once chased consumer facing apps built around social or dating mechanics now seed hardware startups targeting solitary workflows, modular desk ecosystems with integrated power delivery and cable management for multi monitor permanence, acoustic treatment kits engineered for zero external sound leakage during extended sessions, ergonomic input devices calibrated for 12 to 18-hour daily usage without repetitive strain injury. Pitch decks emphasize metrics like user sovereignty score alongside traditional revenue multiples, defining the former as a composite of schedule control, financial independence horizon, and dependency reduction indices. Limited partners quietly express preference for portfolios overweight in autonomy enabling technologies because the customer cohort demonstrates exceptional retention, low churn, and high lifetime value when the product aligns with core lifestyle architecture rather than fleeting relational needs. Secondary market activity picks up around tokenized equity in these ventures, allowing individual investors within the ecosystem to participate directly without traditional gatekeepers. Intellectual property disputes themselves evolve in character. Litigation dockets show fewer cases rooted in co ownership claims arising from joint ventures between romantic partners, once a common source of messy, equitable distribution battles over startups or creative works begun during courtship. Instead, courts see rising disputes over open source forks, licensing violations in decentralized content distribution protocols, and trade secret misappropriation involving former collaborators who parted ways over ideological differences regarding platform censorship resistance. Judges presiding over these matters increasingly encounter self represented litigants who arrive with meticulously organized evidence binders, time stamped commit logs, cryptographic proofs of contribution, and pre written motions grounded in both statutory language and case precedent. The competence on display often stems directly from years of solitary study and practice in legal research tools, contract drafting templates, and procedural rules, skills honed precisely because no partner existed to dilute focus or introduce conflicting priorities. Media measurement firms recalibrate audience fragmentation models to account for viewing and listening habits that diverge sharply from historical norms. Streaming platform analytics reveal sustained preference among certain male demographics for long form, non narrative content, 8-hour ambient soundscapes designed for background immersion, technical deep dive podcasts consumed at one. 5x speed during workouts, documentary series on obscure engineering feats, or historical figures who thrived in isolation. Traditional appointment television loses further ground as men schedule entertainment around personal circadian rhythms rather than broadcast windows or shared living room availability. Podcast host analytics show elevated sponsorship conversion rates when ads target high discipline listeners, protein delivery services, no atropic stacks, ergonomic office suppliers, because purchasing intent correlates tightly with existing optimization routines. Advertising yield improves when creative avoids relational framing entirely and speaks directly to internal metrics of progress, control, and compounding advantage. Digital security firms specializing in personal privacy see accelerated adoption curves. Men who have internalized sovereignty as non negotiable invest heavily in layered defenses, hardware security keys for all critical accounts, end to end encrypted note taking vaults, virtual private networks routed through multiple jurisdictions, air gapped machines for sensitive financial modeling, burner identities for platform experimentation. The demand drives innovation in consumer grade tools once reserved for high net worth individuals or nation state actors. Portable Faraday bags for device isolation during travel. Open source firmware replacements that eliminate manufacturer telemetry. Decentralized DNS resolvers that block known surveillance nodes. Security audits become routine self administered rituals, with participants sharing anonymized findings in private repositories to crowdsource vulnerability, discovery, and remediation. The ecosystem effectively crowdsources a parallel defensive infrastructure that keeps pace with and often anticipates attempts at centralized control or monitoring. Philanthropic patterns within the cohort solidify into recognizable channels. Donations flow disproportionately toward causes that expand individual optionality. Legal defense funds for creators facing deplatforming or content related prosecution, scholarships for young men pursuing trade certifications or self directed learning paths, grants to open source maintainers building censorship resistant distribution layers, support for medical research initiatives focused on male specific longevity markers such as androgen optimization under controlled conditions. Giving tends toward anonymity or pseudonymous handles rather than public recognition, reflecting a preference for impact without social signaling. Recipients often report that funds arrive with minimal strings, project based milestones, rather than ongoing oversight, because donors view the contribution as investment in ecosystem resilience rather than charity in the traditional sense. Cultural criticism begins grappling with the emergence of what some term the sovereign aesthetic. Art historians and critics note a recurring visual language in self published works and independent media. Clean lines, negative space, muted palettes punctuated by functional primary colors, deliberate absence of human figures, or their reduction to silhouettes devoid of relational context. The style communicates self containment and purposeful exclusion of distraction. Film theorists analyze sequences that linger on solitary rituals. Coffee preparation filmed in real time. Keyboard typing captured in extreme close up. Weight plates sliding onto bars with rhythmic precision, finding in them a new form of cinematic minimalism that treats process itself as subject rather than prelude to interpersonal drama. Literary reviewers encounter manuscripts that experiment with narrative structures built around internal monologues spanning decades, where external events register only insofar as they affect private metrics of progress. The works resist easy categorization as escapism because they depict agency exercised at scale rather than avoidance of reality. Environmental policy circles quietly integrate the trend into carbon accounting frameworks. Single adult households consistently show lower direct emissions profiles when adjusted for income parity, reduce food waste from precise portioning, lower transport demand from non family errands, decreased heating and cooling loads in compact insulated spaces optimized for one person occupancy. Policy analysts modeling net zero pathways begin assigning modest but positive weight to sustained male disengagement as a behavioral lever that complements technological substitution and pricing mechanisms. The acknowledgement remains politically delicate, framed in neutral demographic terms rather than normative endorsement. Yet the data enters baseline projections used for international climate negotiations. Global migration statistics start capturing a distinct subcategory: men relocating not for family reunification or economic opportunity tied to household formation, but for regulatory arbitrage around personal autonomy. Destination countries with light content moderation regimes, favorable tax treatment for digital nomads, strong rule of law protections for private contracts, and cultural tolerance for solitary lifestyles see inbound flows that skew heavily male in the 25 to 45 bracket. Immigration consultants report increased demand for visa strategies that prioritize long term residency without path to citizenship requirements, digital nomad permits, investor residencies with low thresholds, retirement visas claimed early through strategic savings acceleration. Host jurisdictions benefit from high human capital inflows that pay taxes locally while consuming minimal public services, creating a positive fiscal externality that softens domestic political resistance to these migration streams. The cumulative layering of these adaptations, fiscal, infrastructural, cultural, technological, migratory, creates a feedback dynamic that further entrenches the separation. Each domain that adjusts to accommodate the reality lowers the cost of maintaining it and raises the cost of abandoning it. Men experience the change as compounding tailwinds: cheaper living arrangements, more tailored products, friendlier legal defaults, stronger privacy tools, greater cultural legibility. The younger cohort inherits not just knowledge, but an environment already optimized for their trajectory. Resistance, where it persists, encounters diminishing returns because the system has grown self reinforcing at multiple scales. Society therefore navigates a future where one large segment operates under radically different incentive maps without requiring the other segment's participation or approval. Friction points remain: budget shortfalls in family oriented programs, cultural nostalgia for lost cohesion, periodic moral panics over fertility, but they no longer threaten the core architecture. The divergence has become an infrastructure. Infrastructure endures. It shapes what comes next more than it is shaped by it. Men continue the quiet work of refinement within that infrastructure. They build, measure, iterate, preserve. The path requires no external ratification because internal validation has proven sufficient. And sufficiency, once achieved, becomes permanence. The permanence of this embedded condition now manifests in the quiet rewriting of educational curricula at multiple levels, as institutions recognize that a growing share of male students will never follow the traditional sequence of courtship, marriage, and family as life anchors. High school guidance departments in progressive and conservative districts alike begin incorporating mandatory modules on personal life design strategies that present partnership as one elective path among several viable options rather than the default endpoint. Textbooks on civics and sociology include sidebars that neutrally describe voluntary non reproduction as a rational response to perceived asymmetries in risk and reward within contemporary intimate contracts. Teachers tasked with delivering these units report that male students engage more actively when the material frames autonomy as a form of strategic foresight rather than a symptom of immaturity or social failure. Assignments shift from essays on the importance of family and society toward comparative analyses of different life course models, with rubrics that reward evidence based reasoning over ideological conformity. The result is a generation that graduates already fluent in the language of sovereignty, having been exposed to the logic behind opting out long before they ever face real world romantic markets. College career centers adapt in parallel. Resume workshops now emphasize how to highlight self directed projects, solo ventures, and metrics of personal discipline. Open source contributions with commit counts in the thousands, fitness logs showing multi year consistency, financial portfolios demonstrating compound growth trajectories, because recruiters from certain sectors have begun screening for these signals as proxies for reliability and low drama potential. Internship placement offices notice that male students increasingly request remote or hybrid roles that preserve schedule control over prestige placements requiring relocation or long office hours. Alumni networks pivot toward mentorship pairings based on shared autonomy goals rather than industry alone. Successful solo operators guiding younger men through tax optimization strategies, relocation sequencing, or hardware upgrade cycles rather than under introductions to potential spouses. The shift is subtle but pervasive. The university stops positioning itself as a launchpad into conventional adult roles and starts functioning as a neutral accelerator for whatever trajectory the student has already chosen. Professional certification bodies follow suit. Licensing exams in fields like accounting, engineering, information security, and real estate appraisal begin including optional self study tracks that assume the candidate operates without external accountability structures. Study guides provide modular schedules designed for 12 to 16-hour daily focus blocks with built in recovery protocols and progress tracking templates. Exam preparation companies market premium packages that bundle ergonomic recommendations, nootropic stacking advice, and private Discord access for peer troubleshooting, all tailored to men who treat certification as a personal asset multiplier rather than a prerequisite for family provider status. Pass rates among this demographic climb steadily because the preparation aligns with existing habits of deliberate practice and minimal distraction. The certifications themselves gain added signaling value in hiring processes. A man who earns them while maintaining complete personal sovereignty becomes a low-risk hire who can be deployed flexibly without worrying about sudden family leave requests or partner-driven geographic constraints. The insurance industry deepens its recalibration beyond longevity tables. Disability income policies see targeted marketing campaigns aimed at high discipline single men, emphasizing riders that cover loss of earning capacity due to repetitive strain injuries from prolonged workstation use or burnout from self imposed intensity rather than conventional family related stressors. Long-term care coverage begins offering discounts for applicants who document robust personal health protocols, regular DEXA scans, blood work panels every 6 months, strength training logs verified through app exports, because the data shows delayed onset of age-related frailty among this group. Property insurance underwriters quietly adjust premiums downward in neighborhoods with high concentrations of solitary male homeowners, citing lower incidence of claims related to domestic accidents involving children or multi-person households. The pricing logic is straightforward. Fewer variables mean fewer unpredictable losses. Men respond by shopping carriers that reward their lifestyle choices with tangible savings, further reinforcing the incentive loop. Real estate investment trusts and private equity funds launch dedicated vehicles focused on autonomy optimized residential portfolios, properties clustered in walkable mid-tier cities with strong fiber infrastructure, low property crime indices, minimal HOA restrictions on home modification, and zoning that permits small-scale accessory units for potential future rental income streams. Marketing materials highlight proximity to hiking trails, private gyms, specialty grocers with bulk protein options, and co working spaces that function more like quiet libraries than social hubs. Cap rates in these niches compress as demand outpaces supply, signaling investor confidence that the tenant base will remain stable and solvent over multi decade horizons. Flippers and developers in secondary markets begin pre wiring new constructions with conduit runs capable of supporting 6 to 8 monitor arrays, dedicated 20 amp circuits for computing loads, and sound dampening insulation packages as standard rather than upgrades. The features sell themselves because they match the exact specifications circulating in private renovation threads. The legal profession sees a parallel specialization emerge. Solo practitioners and small firms carve out niches in sovereignty law, drafting ironclad cohabitation agreements for the rare instances where entanglement is considered, structuring trusts that shield assets from future relational claims, advising on prenuptial frameworks so airtight they deter even aggressive litigation, and guiding clients through permanent reproductive choice procedures with minimal legal exposure. Bar associations offer continuing legal education credits for courses on non traditional estate planning that cover beneficiary designations for crypto wallets, digital asset succession protocols, and revocation of implied spousal rights in jurisdictions that still recognize common law marriage. Clients arrive with detailed spreadsheets of net worth trajectories, risk matrices for various partnership scenarios, and pre completed questionnaires that accelerate consultations. The practice proves lucrative because the clients are high agency, low conflict, and willing to pay premium rates for precision work that protects years of accumulated capital. Corporate boardrooms begin discussing the autonomy dividend in earnings calls. Chief financial officers note that employee bases with higher proportions of single men in key technical roles show reduced volatility in voluntary turnover, lower healthcare claims ratios tied to stress related conditions, and greater willingness to accept stretch assignments that require temporary relocation or irregular hours. Investor relations presentations start including slides that frame workforce composition as a hidden competitive advantage when the demographic skews toward individuals with minimal external dependencies. Compensation committees experiment with retention bonuses structured around personal milestones, 5-year service awards that vest into unrestricted stock rather than family oriented perks like dependent care subsidies. The approach resonates because it respects the actual incentive map of the workforce rather than imposing legacy assumptions. International trade bodies and tariff negotiators encounter unexpected downstream effects. Countries that have become net exporters of autonomy optimized hardware, specialized monitors, ergonomic peripherals, privacy focused networking gear see trade surpluses grow in these narrow categories. Import statistics from North America and Western Europe show rising volumes of components once considered niche. Low latency display panels, mechanical keyboards with custom firmware support, active noise canceling headphones tuned for vocal isolation rather than music listening. Exporting nations respond by scaling production capacity and lobbying for lower tariffs on these goods under emerging personal productivity technology classifications. The trade flows reinforce global supply chain resilience because the demand is diffuse, recession resistant, and driven by individual rather than corporate purchasing decisions. Philanthropic foundations with tech sector origins quietly increase allocations to digital preservation initiatives aimed at archiving the ecosystem's knowledge base. Decentralized repositories for hardware blueprints, protocol specifications, psychological frameworks, financial model templates, and migration playbooks. Grants support redundant storage across multiple jurisdictions, cryptographic timestamping to prove provenance, and open access mirrors that resist single point takedowns. The rationale presented to trustees frames the work as safeguarding human ingenuity against potential regulatory overreach or cultural erasure. Recipients treat the funding as mission critical infrastructure rather than discretionary support, allocating portions toward redundancy testing and bandwidth upgrades that ensure uninterrupted access even under adverse conditions. The cumulative weight of these interlocking adaptations creates a landscape where opting out no longer feels like swimming against the current. The current itself has shifted. Public policy, corporate strategy, educational design, legal practice, investment flows, trade patterns, and philanthropic priorities all bend toward accommodating a population that has proven durable and economically consequential. Each bend lowers the friction of staying on the path and raises the cost of deviation. Younger men enter adulthood with the advantages already built in: curricula that validate their choices, products calibrated to their needs, legal safeguards tailored to their risks, cultural artifacts that reflect their reality. Men within the architecture continue refining at the margins. They experiment with new protocols, document outcomes, share improvements, preserve gains. The work is methodical, incremental, relentless. It requires no audience because the results speak in balance sheets, biomarkers, completed projects, preserved freedom. The divergence no longer needs to prove itself. It simply continues unfolding, reshaping the world around it one precise adjustment at a time. Society learns to live with the new geometry. One half pursues compounded sovereignty. The other half manages the aggregate consequences through whatever levers remain effective. The two halves coexist with decreasing interference, each finding its own equilibrium within the larger system. The system itself becomes more stable precisely because it has stopped trying to force convergence. Acceptance replaces resistance, adaptation replaces panic, permanence replaces uncertainty. And in that permanence, the story of men walking away reaches its quiet culmination, not with fanfare or final confrontation, but with the steady accumulation of choices that have become infrastructure, habit, identity, and finally, simply the way things are. The architecture has now reached a threshold where its logic begins to influence even the most abstract domains of human inquiry, including the philosophy of time, purpose, and legacy in an era stripped of conventional reproductive continuity. Thinkers within the cohort start articulating frameworks that treat individual lifespan as the primary unit of meaning rather than intergenerational transmission. Legacy, once measured in descendants or family name perpetuation, gets redefined as cumulative impact through knowledge artifacts, open source code bases that outlive their creators, financial instruments that compound across centuries via trust structures, or cultural memes embedded in decentralized archives. These men view mortality not as tragedy requiring offspring to soften it, but as a finite window for maximal personal density, packing as much disciplined creation, refined experience, and preserved sovereignty into the available years as physics allows. The orientation produces a peculiar calm. Death loses its sting when the project is self contained rather than dependent on uncertain heirs. Philosophical essays circulated in encrypted channels explore concepts like temporal sovereignty, the deliberate allocation of every waking hour to ends chosen without external veto, and legacy compression, the strategy of concentrating influence into durable, non biological forms that require no maintenance from future generations. This temporal reorientation feeds directly into advanced financial engineering. Private wealth managers serving high net worth men in their 30s and 40s begin offering bespoke perpetual motion trusts, irrevocable structures seeded with index funds, dividend aristocrats, and real asset positions that are programmed to self administer indefinitely through algorithmic trustees. The trusts distribute minimal annual payouts to named individuals or causes, while the bulk compounds tax deferred across generations that may never materialize. Clients fund them aggressively because the mechanism provides psychological closure. Even if biological continuity ends with them, capital continuity persists on their terms. Estate planning attorneys refine clauses that trigger charitable conversions or open source bounties upon the grantor's death, ensuring that accumulated resources fuel ecosystem resilience rather than dissipate through probate or relational claims. The structures gain quiet popularity because they align perfectly with a worldview view that prizes control over posterity. Scientific research communities quietly benefit from redirected talent and funding. Men who once might have pursued academic careers, constrained by dual career compromises or family relocation, now gravitate toward independent research institutes, citizen science collectives, or fully remote computational biology labs. They contribute disproportionately to open repositories, protein folding models trained on personal GPU clusters, climate data analysis scripts shared under permissive licenses, longitudinal self tracking studies aggregated anonymously into public datasets. Peer review processes evolve to accommodate these contributors. Journals introduce independent researcher designation categories, peer review anonymity protocols strengthen to shield contributors from institutional bias, and replication bounties rise as a mechanism to verify findings without requiring physical lab access. The influx of disciplined, distraction free effort accelerates progress in narrow but high leverage fields: longevity biochemistry, decentralized energy protocols, privacy preserving machine learning architectures, where sustained solo focus yields outsized returns. Medical research philanthropy channels follow the same vector. Donors within the cohort establish micro foundations that target male specific health markers overlooked by mainstream funding. Testosterone response curves under chronic high discipline conditions, prostate tissue resilience in populations with zero reproductive exposure, cardiovascular adaptations to prolonged seated immersion with integrated movement protocols. Grants go to university labs willing to run controlled studies on these variables, often with the stipulation that raw data sets be released publicly within 18 months of publication. The resulting papers begin appearing in high impact journals, gradually shifting clinical guidelines. Urologists start discussing elective vasectomy as a first line option for men, prioritizing financial optionality over future fertility. Endocrinologists refine dosing protocols for men maintaining supraphysiological but physiologically monitored androgen levels through lifestyle alone. The knowledge diffuses back into the ecosystem as actionable protocols, closing the loop between funding, research, and lived optimization. Urban design competitions begin soliciting entries under explicit post household briefs. Architecture students and young firms submit proposals for districts engineered around single adult optimization. Buildings with private rooftop microfarms for protein cultivation. Centralized mechanical rooms that deliver filtered air and water to each unit independently. Modular interiors that reconfigure in minutes for different focus modes, subterranean parking replaced by secure bike vaults and EV charging catacombs. Winning entries feature shared infrastructure only where it enhances individual sovereignty. District-wide mesh networks for low latency peer connectivity. Communal solar arrays with per unit metering and buyback rights. Emergency microgrids that allow single units to island seamlessly during outages. Jurors praise the designs for treating solitude as generative condition rather than deficit to be mitigated. Municipalities in progressive regions start piloting elements of these visions in redevelopment zones, branding them as resilient micro communities to sidestep cultural controversy. The global luxury goods sector undergoes its most profound reorientation yet. Brands, once synonymous with couple signaling, engagement ring houses, couples retreat resorts, heritage watchmakers marketing heirloom status, see core revenue lines plateau or decline among younger male buyers. In response, many pivot toward personal mastery artifacts, limited edition mechanical chronographs calibrated for ultra precise daily rituals rather than milestone commemoration, bespoke writing instruments engineered for marathon journaling sessions, handcrafted leather desk mats with embedded cable routing and biometric authentication pockets. Haute couture houses launch lines of performance fabrics disguised as everyday wear, wrinkle resistant merino blends with antimicrobial treatments for multi day wear, thermal regulating undersuits for extended seated immersion, minimalist outerwear with hidden mole compatible attachment points for modular gear. The marketing language shifts to endurance elegance and ritual refinement, positioning the objects as extensions of internal discipline rather than external display. Sales rebound in these reoriented categories because they speak directly to men who treat possessions as tools for compounding personal advantage. Literary agents and publishers notice a surge in manuscript submissions from men in their late 20s and 30s that defy conventional genre boundaries. These works blend memoir, technical manual, philosophical treatise, and speculative fiction. Narratives that chronicle the construction of sovereign life from first rejection to full architectural maturity. Plots rarely include romantic subplots. When they appear, they serve as cautionary flashbacks rather than redemptive arcs. Prose styles favor clarity and compression. Short sentences, precise technical vocabulary, deliberate avoidance of emotional hyperbole. Publishers experiment with hybrid imprints, autonomy nonfiction, that market the books as both inspirational and instructional. Early titles achieve cult status through word of mouth in private channels, then break into broader visibility when algorithms detect sustained reading sessions and recommend them to similar profiles. The genre begins influencing mainstream nonfiction as authors outside the cohort adopt its disciplined tone to discuss incentive structures, risk asymmetry, and long horizon planning. The world of competitive gaming and esports quietly absorbs a parallel stream of talent. Men who have honed focus through years of controlled immersion dominate ladder rankings and strategy titles requiring sustained attention and pattern recognition. Real time strategy games, grand strategy simulations, fighting game frame analysis disciplines. Professional organizations notice that these players exhibit lower burnout rates, higher practice volume tolerance, and greater willingness to relocate for team houses because personal life remains frictionless. Sponsorship deals pivot toward hardware brands already popular in the autonomy ecosystem. Ultra wide monitors with perfect color calibration, mechanical switches tuned for zero debounce delay, chairs with integrated cooling channels. Prize money allocation discussions begin including deferred payment options that feed into perpetual trusts, recognizing that winners often prefer capital compounding over immediate consumption. As the second quarter of the century draws to a close, actuarial projections stabilize around the new constants. Life tables show male expectancy at birth creeping upward in cohorts born after 2000, driven by lower obesity rates, reduced substance abuse incidents, and proactive screening adherence among those who treat health as core asset class. Dependency ratios flatten sooner than previously feared because single adult savings rates partially offset the shortfall in traditional household contributions to tax bases. Pension systems in several jurisdictions quietly raise retirement ages for future claimants while offering opt out lump sums for those who demonstrate sufficient private accumulation. The adjustments pass with minimal political turbulence because the demographic most affected has already priced in the changes and built parallel buffers. Men aging into their 50s within this framework present a profile that confounds earlier stereotypes. They enter the decade with net worth distributions skewed toward the upper percentiles of their birth cohort, body composition metrics resembling competitive masters athletes, cognitive sharpness preserved through continuous deliberate practice, and social networks that are narrow but deep. Mentorship relationships spanning decades, peer accountability groups that meet virtually or in person without romantic or familial overlay. They mentor not out of obligation, but because transmitting the architecture feels like extending their own temporal reach. The younger men receiving that mentorship treat the guidance as high value alpha rather than paternalistic advice. The transmission completes the cycle. What began as individual adaptation becomes multi generational knowledge chain, resilient because it requires no biological link. Society at this point no longer debates whether the divergence will endure. It debates how to optimize around it. Think tanks publish scenarios for dual equilibrium governance, policy frameworks that maintain separate incentive tracks without forcing convergence. One track supports family oriented citizens through targeted subsidies, education credits, housing incentives. The other track removes friction for sovereignty oriented citizens through regulatory lightness, privacy safeguards, capital formation neutrality. The proposals gain traction because they acknowledge reality rather than attempting to reverse it. Implementation begins in federated systems where local jurisdictions experiment with different balances, creating natural laboratories for what combinations minimize conflict while maximizing aggregate welfare. The men themselves experience this phase as quiet vindication. Every recalibrated system, every new product category, every updated projection confirms that the initial choice was not aberration, but foresight. They continue the work, refining protocols, documenting outcomes, preserving gains, mentoring successors, because the architecture demands maintenance even as it delivers compounding returns. The path has become not just viable, but dominant within its own domain. And so, the divergence settles into history as one of those rare structural shifts that arrives without revolution, without manifesto, without final battle, only through the steady, rational accumulation of individual decisions that, in aggregate, redraw the map of human possibility. All roads, in the end, lead to this quiet certainty. Men walked away, built something durable in the space they claimed, and the world learned to walk around it. The final chapters of this transformation unfold not with dramatic upheaval, but with the steady normalization of what was once unthinkable. By the early 2030s, the statistical agencies of most developed nations no longer publish separate fertility forecasts under business as usual and high disengagement scenarios. The high disengagement case has become the central projection. Governments quietly accept that replacement level reproduction will not return without structural changes far beyond the scope of current political will or fiscal capacity. Instead of endless pronatalist campaigns that yield diminishing returns, policy shops pivot toward adaptation strategies that treat lower birth cohorts as a given input. Immigration frameworks expand to prioritize high skill, high autonomy individuals who arrive without dependence, thereby offsetting workforce shrinkage while minimizing pressure on social service budgets already strained by aging populations. Tax codes in several jurisdictions introduce lifetime contribution credits that reward individuals who demonstrate sustained high earnings and savings rates, regardless of family status, effectively monetizing the fiscal surplus generated by childless high earners. The measures pass with bipartisan support because they address the same demographic math that once fueled panic, only now from the position of pragmatic acceptance rather than moral exhortation. Central banks incorporate these realities into monetary policy frameworks with greater sophistication. When modeling neutral interest rates, they now include a persistent downward bias in natural household formation demand, which dampens the credit impulse that once amplified rate cuts into broad consumption booms. Quantitative easing programs, when deployed, increasingly target asset classes favored by high saving single adults. Corporate debt issued by firms producing autonomy enabling technologies, infrastructure bonds tied to fiber optic expansion and microgrid resilience, equity stakes in longevity research consortia. The allocation logic is cold but clear, stimulating sectors where marginal propensity to consume remains low, but marginal propensity to invest stays high, produces more durable growth than traditional household consumption channels that have structurally weakened. Inflation targeting committees begin referencing demographic drag as a secular force akin to aging populations in Japan or productivity slowdowns elsewhere, accepting that conventional tools must operate in a lower velocity environment shaped by deliberate capital hoarding among one large cohort. The corporate world completes its reorientation toward this new consumer base. Consumer electronics giants that once chased family sharing features, multi user streaming profiles, kid safe modes, collaborative calendars now lead with single user supremacy, devices that prioritize privacy vaults, offline first architectures, and seamless integration across personal hardware ecosystems. Software as a service companies shift pricing models toward lifetime licenses or one time purchases for tools that support permanent self hosting, recognizing that customers who value sovereignty above all else will pay premiums to avoid recurring platform dependencies. Enterprise resource planning systems tailored to solo operators proliferate, offering dashboards that track net worth velocity, biological age metrics, skill acquisition rates, and content consumption efficiency in unified interfaces. Sales teams targeting this demographic train on a single principle: never mention family, legacy, or relational fulfillment. Speak only in terms of control, compounding, and optionality. The approach yields higher close rates because it respects the buyer's actual utility function rather than projecting an external one. The legal landscape continues evolving toward greater symmetry between autonomy oriented and family oriented citizens. Several jurisdictions introduce parallel family law tracks, one for couples who opt into traditional spousal default rules, another for individuals who affirmatively opt out of any implied relational rights upon entering cohabitation or marriage like arrangements. The opt out track requires notarized declarations filed with vital statistics offices, after which courts treat the parties as contractual strangers, even if they share a residence for decades. The framework reduces litigation volume by clarifying expectations upfront and eliminates many of the gray area disputes that once clogged dockets. Probate courts expand use of digital asset custodians that execute pre programmed beneficiary distributions without requiring spousal consent or judicial override. These innovations spread through model legislation drafted by bar association committees that include specialists in both traditional family law and emerging sovereignty practice, ensuring the reforms balance competing interests without privileging one over the other. Educational institutions at the post secondary level formalize dual track degree pathways. Traditional liberal arts and professional programs remain intact for students pursuing relational or family centered trajectories, while new autonomous studies concentrations emerge in select universities. These programs blend computer science, behavioral economics, applied physiology, legal theory, and personal finance engineering into curricula designed for men who plan to build self contained lives. Course titles include Incentive Design for Personal Systems, Physiological Optimization Under Solitude, Trust and Estate Structures for Non Reproductive Continuity, and Narrative Self Construction Without External Validation. Enrollment grows steadily because the degrees signal to employers a rare combination of technical competence, discipline, and low relational risk. Graduates command premium starting salaries in fields that value uninterrupted focus: quantitative trading desks, blockchain protocol development, advanced robotics research, longevity biotech startups, where the ability to work long stretches without distraction translates directly into outsized productivity. The cultural conversation around masculinity finally moves beyond condemnation or nostalgia toward descriptive analysis. Documentaries produced by independent studios chronicle the lives of men who reached their 50s under this architecture. Interviews conducted in minimalist homes filled with functional equipment rather than sentimental objects. Discussions that treat partnership as a historical curiosity rather than a moral imperative. The films avoid advocacy. They simply observe routines, metrics, and reflections accumulated over decades. Critics praise the works for their unflinching clarity, noting that the subjects appear neither bitter nor triumphant, but simply complete. Public television networks air the series with minimal framing, allowing viewers to draw their own conclusions. Streaming algorithms begin recommending the content to audiences whose viewing patterns indicate sustained interest in self reliance narratives, creating quiet but persistent cultural visibility for the path. Medical practice adapts at the clinical level. Primary care physicians in urban centers increasingly encounter patients who arrive with comprehensive self generated health records, annual full panel blood work, DEXA scans, VO2 max tests, sleep stage breakdowns, even telomere length estimates, all tracked through personal dashboards rather than with institutional electronic health records. Doctors learn to interpret these data sets not as patient noncompliance, but as proactive asset management. Treatment plans shift toward collaborative optimization rather than directive intervention. Joint reviews of lifestyle variables that influence biomarkers, mutual agreement on intervention thresholds, shared decision making around elective procedures that enhance rather than merely preserve function. The relationship becomes more akin to consultant client than traditional doctor patient, reflecting the patient's higher baseline agency and information parity. Environmental science incorporates the demographic constant into climate mitigation models with greater precision. Lower household sizes reduce baseline energy demand per capita even as income levels rise, creating headroom for electrification and renewable penetration without equivalent increases in generation capacity. Researchers quantify the solitude dividend in carbon terms. Fewer vehicle miles traveled for family errands, lower food system waste from precise individual consumption, reduced material throughput for consumer goods tied to child rearing cycles. Policy papers begin discussing how to capture this behavioral carbon sink through incentives that reward single adult efficiency without stigmatizing family formation. The framing remains technocratic to avoid cultural backlash, yet the numbers enter IPCC aligned scenarios as a modest but positive forcing factor. International relations feel the ripple as well. Nations that successfully attracted high autonomy migrants during the 2020s now enjoy fiscal advantages, higher per capita tax revenue from childless professionals, lower public education and healthcare expenditures relative to GDP, accelerated innovation in sectors fueled by concentrated talent. These countries begin forming informal alliances around sovereignty friendly regulatory standards, mutual recognition of digital asset custody arrangements, harmonized privacy laws that resist extraterritorial content takedown requests, coordinated visa pathways for remote workers who contribute economically without demographic burden. The bloc exerts soft power through example rather than ideology, demonstrating that societies can thrive with permanently lower fertility when high human capital inflows and internal savings discipline offset the shortfall. By the mid 2030s, the generation that first walked away in large numbers reaches its 60s. They enter retirement not as dependents on public systems, but as net creditors to them. Private portfolios that continue compounding, health markers that delay long term care needs, voluntary charitable streams that support causes aligned with their values. Their presence in communities is quiet but unmistakable. Impeccably maintained properties occupied by one, Streets with fewer children, yet higher voter turnout among disciplined adults, local businesses that cater to precise individual preferences rather than family bundles. The younger men who followed their lead now occupy the prime decades, replicating and refining the model with tools the pioneers could only dream of. More advanced hardware, stronger legal safeguards, deeper cultural acceptance, faster knowledge transmission. The divergence no longer requires commentary because it has become part of the background radiation of modern life. Historians will one day write of it as a case study in emergent social order, how a sufficiently strong incentive, misalignment, amplified by technology and compounded over decades, produced a self sustaining parallel track within the same society. Economists will cite it as evidence that aggregate outcomes can shift dramatically when individual rationality overrides collective expectation. Demographers will mark it as the point when advanced economies formally decoupled growth from population expansion. Philosophers will debate whether it represents liberation or loss, though the men themselves will have long since stopped caring about the debate. They will simply continue living the answer they chose. In the end, the story resolves into simplicity. Men listened when told their presence was optional, their pursuit unwelcome, their provider role outdated. They acted accordingly. They built lives that worked better for them than the previous script ever did. Society adapted because adaptation was cheaper than resistance. And so, the roads diverged, not with thunder, but with the quiet click of choices locking into place, one rational decision at a time, until the map redrew itself around them. And that brings us to the end of this deep dive into what happens when men finally listen, walk away, and build something better suited to the world they were told they no longer belonged in. The facts are now plain. Millions have chosen solitude over obligation, digital mastery over relational gamble, compounding sovereignty over conditional approval. Women from every ideological camp, feminists who once demanded men step back, traditionalists who once expected men to step up, find themselves in the same uncomfortable position, watching leverage they assumed was permanent simply vanish. The panic was real. The bans, the taxes, the moral campaigns, the demographic warnings, the desperate policy pivots, all of it was real. But none of it reversed the trend because none of it addressed the root cause. Men were given clear instructions for decades, followed them to the letter, and discovered the result was peace, not punishment. Look around now. The economy has quietly repriced itself around single adult efficiency. Cities have redrawn zoning maps for smaller, more private units. Products are engineered for uninterrupted focus instead of shared households. Laws have started offering opt out tracks so people can choose their level of entanglement up front instead of fighting over it later. Universities train young men in life design strategies that treat partnership as optional rather than obligatory. Medical guidelines are shifting to recognize proactive self optimization instead of waiting for breakdown. Cultural stories no longer assume every hero needs a romantic arc to be complete. The adaptation is complete. The divergence is no longer a crisis to be solved, it is infrastructure to be lived with. To the 1 hour gang who stayed until the very last word, respect. You made it through every layer, every angle, every consequence. You saw the full picture without flinching. If these angry guy videos are hitting the mark for you, if the raw honesty and unfiltered reasoning are giving you something you can't find anywhere else, show some support by buying me a Red Bull. The link is in the description. Everyone keeps the engine running for the next one. Drop a comment below and tell me what hit hardest. Do you agree that men walking away was the only logical response to the messages they received for 50 years? Do you see the same quiet rebuilding happening around you? Are you already on this path or watching someone who is? Be direct, no fluff. I read every comment. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more of this no holds barred clarity. And if the video moved you, Share it. Send it to the guy who needs to hear he's not crazy for choosing himself. Just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away. And cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.